Imagine a night somewhere in Persia, around 334 BC. The fires are burning in the great palace complexes. The administrative machinery of the largest empire the world had ever seen is quietly humming along, processing grain tallies and tribute payments and military dispatches from a dozen different provinces. From the shores of the Aegean Sea to the edges of what we now call Pakistan, from the mountains of Central Asia down to the deserts of Egypt, one empire holds everything together. Not loosely, not tenuously, but with centuries of weight behind it. Roads connecting distant cities, royal couriers carrying orders across thousands of miles, governors administering land so remote from the centre that the journey between them could take months on horseback. This is the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and on this particular night nobody inside it has any particular reason to worry. That's what makes what happens next so astonishing. Within roughly a decade, it's gone. Not weakened, not reduced. Gone. Dismantled by a single man from a kingdom that most Persians would barely have considered a serious rival. A young Macedonian king, not yet 30 years old, with an army that was modest by Persian standards, crossed into Asia and fought 3 major battles. 3. And after those 3 battles, the largest empire on earth ceased to exist. The more you sit with that, the more impossible it sounds. The Achaemenid Empire had survived for over 2 centuries. It had faced rebellions, assassinations, Greek coalitions, Scythian incursions. It had absorbed everything thrown at it and continued, vast and complex and seemingly permanent. Empires like that don't just end, except this one did. His name was Alexander. History would eventually attach the word great to it, though he probably didn't need the help. He was the king of Macedon, a kingdom in the northern part of the Greek world that many Greeks of his era regarded with something between respect and mild condescension. Not quite barbarian, not quite properly civilized, a frontier people who had recently become very good at war. Alexander's father, Philip II, had transformed Macedonia into a military power in a single generation. And then Philip died, and his 20-year-old son inherited a kingdom, an army, and an ambition that seems, even now, almost too large to fully comprehend. What we're going to explore together is how 3 decisive engagements, at a river called the Granicus, at a coastal plain near a city called Issus, and finally at a place called Gaugamela, combined to undo something that had taken centuries to build. We'll follow the geography of the campaign, the psychology of the commanders, the mechanics of how battles were actually fought in the 4th century BC. We'll look at what the sources tell us, and we'll acknowledge where those sources disagree or where certainty gives way to informed speculation, because ancient history rarely offers the kind of clean, confident answers we might prefer. But we'll also try to simply be there, to feel the weight of the thing, the dust and the heat and the distance, the extraordinary strangeness of watching an unstoppable empire absorb one shock, then another, and then finally come apart. This is a story about power, and how fragile it can turn out to be. It's a story about one man's astonishing capacity for calculated violence and strategic vision. And it's a story that, depending on where you sit, ends in triumph or catastrophe, or both at once. If you're watching this to drift off to sleep, that's exactly what these videos are here for. There's something about the deep past, about stories that happened so long ago that all the urgency is drained out of them, that makes the mind finally go quiet. So settle in, let the distance of the centuries do its work, and I do want to know where you are right now. What time is it where you are? Are you somewhere quiet, late at night, with the house finally still? Or is it early morning and you're easing into the day? Drop it in the comments. Someone in Tehran at midnight and someone in Melbourne at sunrise and someone in Chicago at 2 a.m. are all here together, listening to the same story about a night when an empire still seemed unbreakable. Let's start at the beginning. To understand what Alexander did, you first have to understand where he came from, because Macedonia, in the decades before his birth, was not the kind of place that produced world conquerors. It was a kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world, perpetually caught between being underestimated by its southern neighbours and being pressured by the tribal peoples pressing in from the north and west. Greek city-states like Athens and Thebes regarded Macedonians with a complicated mixture of acknowledgement and dismissal. They were Greek-adjacent, culturally speaking. They spoke a dialect of Greek. They competed at the Olympic Games. But they weren't Athens. They weren't part of the sophisticated, philosophically self-congratulatory world of the polis. They were something older and rougher. A kingdom ruled by a warrior aristocracy, where the king had to earn his authority over powerful noble families who could, and occasionally did, simply refuse to cooperate. Then came Philip II. Alexander's father was one of the most consequential rulers in the ancient world, a fact that tends to get quietly buried by his son's subsequent achievements. Philip came to power around 359 BC in circumstances that were genuinely desperate. Macedonia was being picked apart. Illyrian tribes had just inflicted a catastrophic defeat on a Macedonian army. Parts of the kingdom were occupied or under threat. The treasury was depleted. The nobility was fractious. A lesser man might have spent his reign simply trying to hold the pieces together. Philip did something else entirely. Within a decade, he had transformed Macedonia's army into the most sophisticated military instrument in the ancient world. The innovation that made everything possible was the sarissa, a pike somewhere between 15 and 20 feet long, wielded in close formation infantry units called the Macedonian phalanx. When these formations advanced, the overlapping reach of multiple rows of pikes created a wall of iron points that conventional infantry simply could not get through. No shield was wide enough, no courage enough. You either broke the phalanx from the flanks or you didn't break it at all. But Philip didn't rely only on his infantry. He built up the companion cavalry, elite horsemen drawn largely from the Macedonian nobility, who fought not as skirmishers or harassers, but as a true shock force, designed to exploit the gaps that the phalanx created. The tactical idea was to hold an enemy in place with the phalanx and then hit them from the flank or rear with cavalry at precisely the right moment. It sounds straightforward. Executing it in the chaos of an actual battle required training, discipline, and timing of a kind that most armies of the period couldn't approach. Philip also spent years rebuilding the command structure, professionalizing the officer corps, and integrating siege engineers, light infantry, and allied troops into a flexible combined arms force. He wasn't just building soldiers, he was building a system, and then he used it to extend Macedonian power over most of the Greek world, culminating at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where a joint Athenian and Theban force was broken, and the political independence of the Greek city-states effectively ended. Standing in the Macedonian cavalry line at Chaeronea, commanding the decisive charge that shattered the famous Theban sacred band, was an 18-year-old named Alexander. Philip was planning something even larger when he was assassinated in 336 BC, killed by one of his own bodyguards at a wedding celebration. The circumstances remain murky after more than 2,000 years of scrutiny. Some ancient sources hint at conspiracy reaching into the royal court. Others suggest a personal grievance. The exact truth is probably irrecoverable. What is certain is that Philip died with a Persian invasion already being organized, advance forces already across the Hellespont, and the throne passing to a 20-year-old who had been groomed for command but had not yet proven himself as a king in his own right. The moment was dangerous in ways that are easy to underestimate now. The Macedonian kingship was not automatically stable. Alexander had half-brothers with rival claims and nobles who might recalculate their loyalties with Philip gone. The Greek city-states that Philip had subordinated smelled opportunity in the transition. Thebes moved toward open revolt. Athens debated it. Tribal kingdoms to the north and west, kept in check by Philip's authority, began probing the edges. Alexander's response was fast and unambiguous. He moved south into Greece before the situation could solidify against him. He met with the Greek states and had himself recognized as the leader of the Corinthian League, the alliance Philip had built. He went to Corinth, where, according to a famous story, he met the philosopher Diogenes living in a large ceramic jar and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes reportedly told him to stand aside because he was blocking the sun. Alexander, it said, replied that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. Whatever the historical accuracy of that exchange, it captures something real about how Alexander wanted to be seen. Not just a conqueror, but a man of culture and philosophical seriousness. A Greek in spirit even when Greece wasn't entirely sure what to make of him. He then turned north, moving with the speed that would become his signature, campaigning against the tribal confederacies on Macedonia's borders, pushing all the way to the Danube. While he was there, a rumour spread through Greece that he had been killed. Thebes rose in revolt, massacring the Macedonian garrison. Alexander marched back south faster than anyone thought possible, appeared before Thebes before the city had fully organised its defences, and after a brief siege destroyed it almost completely. Tens of thousands of Thebans were enslaved. The city was levelled, with the notable exception of temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message landed across Greece with complete clarity. There would be no more testing the resolve of this particular king. By the time Alexander turned his attention to Persia, he was not quite 22 years old, and Greece was quiet behind him. The invasion he was preparing carried multiple layers of justification, and it's worth thinking about all of them at once. There was the revenge narrative, the idea that Macedonia and the Greek League were finally striking back for the Persian invasions of 480 and 479 BC, for the burning of Athens, for the long shadow that Persia had cast over Greek politics for generations. This framing gave the campaign legitimacy in Greek eyes, and positioned Alexander as the defender of Greek civilization. There was also pure ambition of a kind that's almost difficult to take seriously until you watch it actually succeed. Alexander had grown up on Homer, had reportedly slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow alongside a dagger. He saw himself in the lineage of Achilles. He wanted not just victory but glory of the kind that would outlast him. These were not separate motivations. They were braided together in a way that probably even Alexander couldn't fully untangle. And there was the practical political dimension. A young king who had inherited his father's throne, who needed to hold together ambitious generals and a restless nobility, needed a great shared enterprise to channel all of that energy outward. A foreign war of conquest, especially one that offered staggering wealth in tribute and plunder, was the kind of undertaking that could bind a kingdom together in ways that peace never quite managed. He had the army, he had the momentum, he had a cause, several of them depending on who was listening. What he didn't yet have was proof that any of it would actually work. That proof was waiting for him on the other side of a narrow strip of water called the Hellespont. What Alexander was pointing himself at was not simply large. It was by any reasonable measure the largest and most administratively complex political structure the world had ever produced. The Achaemenid Empire at its height stretched from the eastern shores of the Aegean to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, from the highlands of Central Asia down through Egypt and across into Libya. If you stood at one end of it and tried to walk to the other, moving at a reasonable pace every single day, the journey would take the better part of a year. Within that territory lived somewhere between 30 and 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, farming entirely different landscapes, and living under conditions that varied from the irrigated river valleys of Mesopotamia to the high deserts of Bactria to the lush Nile delta. Holding all of it together required something more than brute force. It required a system. The system the Persians built was called the satrapy. The empire was divided into roughly 20 to 30 provinces, each governed by a satrap, essentially a regional viceroy who answered directly to the king. Satraps collected tribute, maintained order, raised local military forces when required, and administered justice according to local custom. The genius of the arrangement was its flexibility. The Persians, unlike some conquerors before and after them, did not demand that everyone become Persian. Local religions, local languages, local legal traditions were largely left intact. What the king demanded was tribute and loyalty, and as long as those were forthcoming, a remarkable degree of autonomy was permitted. Egyptian priests kept their temples. Babylonian merchants kept their contracts. Jewish communities in exile kept their scriptures. The empire absorbed diversity rather than suppressing it. Connecting it all were roads. The Royal Road in particular, running roughly 1,700 miles from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa near the Persian heartland, was an engineering achievement that allowed royal messengers to cover in a week what a normal traveller would take 3 months to walk. Herodotus marvelled at the Persian postal system, noting that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevented its couriers from completing their rounds, which is where the famous inscription on the New York post office actually comes from. These roads meant information could move, armies could move, tribute could move. The king could in theory project his authority across thousands of miles with a speed that no purely tribal or regional power could match. The wealth that flowed through this system was almost incomprehensible to the world outside it. The treasuries at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana had been accumulating gold and silver for generations. When Alexander eventually reached them, the amounts recorded by ancient sources strain credibility, even accounting for exaggeration. One estimate suggests Alexander captured enough bullion to load 10,000 pairs of mules. Whether that specific figure is accurate or not, the point stands. Persia was not just powerful. It was rich in a way that made every other political entity in the known world look like a provincial backwater. Into this structure, in 336 BC, came a new king. Darius III had not expected to rule. He had come to the throne through a series of palace intrigues and deaths, surviving in a court where proximity to power was often a prelude to assassination rather than elevation. Ancient sources describe him as physically imposing, tall and strong, and at least one account credits him with personal courage under pressure. But he inherited an empire that was showing stress fractures he hadn't created and couldn't entirely control. Satraps in the western provinces had grown accustomed to a degree of independence that approached autonomy. Egypt had recently been reconquered after a period of revolt and remained restive. The western frontier, perpetually complicated by the squabbling Greek city-states and Macedonian ambitions, was already being probed by Philip's advance forces when Darius took power. He was a capable administrator managing an enormous inheritance, but he had not yet been tested in the way that would soon be required of him. Looking at this from the outside, which is to say looking at it the way any informed observer in 334 BC would have looked at it, the expectation was obvious. Persia should win. Not immediately perhaps, not without difficulty, but ultimately, inevitably. The mathematics of it seemed irresistible. Alexander was crossing into Asia with somewhere around 40,000 soldiers. The Achaemenid Empire could theoretically mobilize forces from dozens of satrapies, draw on Greek mercenaries who were battle-hardened and experienced, field a navy that dwarfed anything Macedonia had, and simply wait for the logistical reality of a small invading army operating deep in hostile territory to grind the whole enterprise down. Persia had absorbed challenges before. The Scythians had raided from the north. The Egyptians had revolted. Greek city-states had defied Persian authority for generations. Each time the empire had bent, adjusted, and eventually reasserted control. The assumption was that this Macedonian adventure would follow the same arc. A sharp engagement or two, perhaps a bloody nose for the invaders, and then the slow, inexorable weight of Persian resources would do what resources always do. What everyone was calculating incorrectly was the combination on the other side. Not just Alexander's ability, though that was real, but the specific thing his army could do that Persian imperial power had no ready answer for. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander rode to the edge of his world and found a narrow strip of water separating it from the next. The Hellespont is not an ocean. At its tightest point it's only a few kilometers across, a pinch in the land where Europe and Asia almost touch. But for Greeks, that channel was more than geography. It was a line between stories. On one side lay the lands of Homer, the cities and islands whose names filled children's ears. On the other was the setting of those stories that felt half real, half mythic. Troy, the plain where Achilles ran, the shore where Agamemnon's ships once beached in imagination and song. Alexander did not treat it as a simple ferry crossing. Ancient sources say that when his ships reached the Asian shore, he did something that makes sense only if you understand how much of his campaign was theatre as well as war. He took a spear, leapt from his ship onto the beach, and drove the weapon into the soil. He declared that he accepted Asia as spear-won land, as if the continent were already legally his because the tip of a Macedonian weapon had touched it. It's easy to hear that as youthful arrogance, a dramatic flourish from a 20-year-old king. It was that. But it was also a message. To his men it said, "We're not sneaking into someone else's territory. We are claiming what should already belong to us." To the Greeks who would hear the story later it said, "This is not an unprovoked invasion of a distant empire. This is the beginning of a just war of revenge and liberation, a new Trojan expedition led by a better Achilles." The symbolism didn't stop at the shoreline. He made a detour before he marched inland, not to seize a fortress or a supply depot, but to visit a ruin. The site was called Ilion, or what locals believe to be the remains of ancient Troy. Archaeology has its own debates about layers and dates, but for Alexander and his companions the question wasn't academic. This was the place where Hector fell, where Achilles dragged his body, where the greatest of Greek heroes had fought and died. Alexander laid a wreath on the supposed tomb of Achilles. According to one tradition, he ran naked or lightly clothed round it, imitating the funeral games described in the Iliad. He left his own armour in the temple of Athena, and took from it a set of supposedly ancient weapons to carry with him. Whether those weapons were actually centuries old or simply ceremonial doesn't really matter. What mattered is that his companions saw him consciously step into a role, not just king, but heir to myth. This was not some private spiritual pilgrimage. It was political communication, performed in front of the officers who would retell it to the rank and file, who would retell it again to the cities back home. Alexander was weaving himself into the fabric of stories everyone already knew by heart. If Achilles had crossed here, Alexander would cross here. If the Trojan War had been the great Greek expedition to Asia, this would be the second, greater one. Behind the gestures and the poetry, the numbers told a very different, more fragile story. Alexander did not bring a nation with him. He brought an elite expeditionary force that, by ancient standards, was sharp but small. Roughly 30 to 40,000 troops in total, depending on which ancient inventory you trust and how you count the support staff. At the core were about 12,000 Macedonian phalangites, the men who stood in dense ranks with pikes so long they looked like fields of metal growing out of human bodies. Alongside them marched several thousand heavier infantry from allied Greek cities, some willingly sent, some encouraged under the weight of Macedonian hegemony. Added to that were the hypaspists, Alexander's more flexible foot guards, and perhaps 7,000 light infantry and skirmishers, archers, javelin throwers, slingers from the rougher mountain regions where such skills were daily tools rather than specialized training. Most dangerous of all, and least numerous, were his cavalry. Around 5,000 horsemen in total. The companion cavalry, nobles and aristocrats who rode close to Alexander himself, and allied Thessalian cavalry who were nearly as good. On a battlefield, these units were scalpels. They broke lines, exploited gaps, turned enemy flanks into traps. On a map of the Achaemenid Empire, they barely registered. Financially, too, Alexander's position was not what the later legends might make you imagine. He was not a wealthy conqueror bursting forth from a full treasury. Philip II had left him a state that was powerful but heavily leveraged. The preparations for this very invasion, the bribes paid to Greek cities, the standing army needed to enforce Macedonian control, had strained royal finances hard. Ancient writers talk about debts running into hundreds of talents, vast sums by the standards of the time. Put simply, Alexander crossed into Asia needing this campaign to work. His army's pay depended on future revenues, not current reserves. The promise he offered his men was not, "Serve me, and I will spend this stored wealth on you," but "Serve me, and we will go together to where the gold actually is." That meant marching directly into the tax base of the Persian king and gambling that he could live off it before the empire's defenders concentrated and crushed him. On the Persian side, the first reaction was not panic. It was irritation mixed with confidence. Alexander had already irritated them once by burning down the Persian naval base at Sardis and by assuming leadership of the so-called Pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia that Philip had organized. But an army of 40,000, however professional, was still just that. 40,000. These satraps in Western Asia Minor had more than that on paper, if they could coordinate. Several key men were watching the Hellespont and the coastal cities as Alexander made his move. In Hellespontine Phrygia there was Arsites, a satrap responsible for that stretch of land facing Europe. Nearby was Spithridates of Lydia and Ionia. Over them in influence, if not in formal hierarchy, was Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary commander serving Persian interests, experienced in fighting exactly the kind of enemies Alexander brought. These men were not fools. Memnon in particular understood the danger of allowing a highly mobile, well-led force to establish itself on the Asian side of the straits. According to several sources, he advised a strategy that sounds almost modern in its strategic depth. Do not fight them head-on at once. Use the fleet. Carry the war back across the water into Greece and Macedonia. Burn the fields, stir up revolt, cut Alexander's supply lines, force him either to rush home or starve in Asia. It was a plan designed to cash in the empire's advantages: sea power, money to fund mercenaries, and the ability to wage a long war. It required patience, coordination, and a willingness to let Alexander move inland unanswered for a time. That last part was the sticking point. For Persian satraps whose status depended on local prestige, on being seen to keep order in their own jurisdictions, the idea of simply watching a foreign army march unopposed through their territory was intolerable. It risked making them look weak to their own subjects and to their king. Better, they thought, to call up regional forces, hire Greek mercenaries of their own, and teach this Macedonian youth a lesson near the coast before he could get far. So they began to muster. Cavalry from the plains of Asia Minor, infantry from their own levies, mercenaries whose loyalties followed the silver they were paid with. Orders went out along the royal road. Messages travelled by horse and relay, carrying news of a crossing that looked, to most who heard of it, like a containable nuisance rather than the beginning of the end. Somewhere in those early days on Asian soil, Alexander and his officers would have been hearing rumours of these preparations. Reports from scouts, from local informants, from frightened or opportunistic Greek communities under Persian rule. The satraps are gathering. There will be a battle. It will happen sooner rather than later. For Alexander, that was not entirely bad news. He needed a decisive encounter near the coast for the same reason the satraps wanted it: politics. His alliance of Greek states back in Europe had to see victory, or they would start to doubt. His own soldiers needed proof that this wasn't a march toward a slow, grinding death in some Anatolian backwater. His empty treasury needed plunder. Somewhere ahead, on a river whose name few of his men had heard of, those two sets of calculations were already on a collision course. Persian satraps seeking to prove their loyalty with a sharp defeat of the invader. A young king looking for a stage large enough to show that his gamble was more than bravado. The Hellespont was behind them now. The first true test of what this small, dangerous army could do lay only a few days' march away. He reached the river in the late afternoon. Later historians will call it the Battle of the Granicus, as if the river itself were some famous boundary everyone recognized. To most of the men in Alexander's ranks, it was just another strip of cold, fast-moving water cutting through unfamiliar hills in northwestern Asia Minor. But rivers, in ancient warfare, are rarely just rivers. The Granicus in spring ran high, swollen with meltwater from the interior. Its banks were cut into steep, muddy slopes in many places, with patches where the ground shelved more gently toward the current. The streambed hid rocks and sudden drops. Cross it in the wrong way, at the wrong time, and an army turned into an uncoordinated mess of struggling men and floundering horses. Alexander's scouts rode back with the same report, repeated from different directions. The Persians were waiting on the far bank. The satraps had done what ambitious officials usually do when a chance for personal glory appears. They had hurried to be first. Their position seemed strong on paper. They occupied the eastern bank of the river, on ground that rose away from the water. They had time to choose where to assemble and how to deploy. They had local supply. They didn't have to worry about being attacked mid-crossing. If Alexander wanted a fight, he'd have to give it to them uphill through water. Their deployment reflected that confidence, and also a crucial misjudgment. Instead of lining the far bank with infantry to hold the heights, while cavalry stood behind as a mobile reserve, the Persian commanders packed their mounted troops right at the water's edge. Ancient descriptions differ on exact numbers, but what emerges is a front of maybe 10 to 15,000 cavalry drawn up in dense lines, stirrupless riders on powerful horses, armoured in scale or quilted protection, lances and javelins in hand. Behind them, on the higher ground, they positioned their hired Greek mercenary infantry. These were not levies with spears and hope. They were professionals, men who had fought in tight phalanxes for years, who understood the weight and rhythm of heavy infantry combat. In terms of quality, they were the closest thing the Persians had to a match for Macedonian foot. But the choice to place them behind the cavalry meant they would be spectators for the opening, most critical phase of the battle. For a time, the fight at the river would be horse against horse. Alexander rode forward to study the scene. What he saw was tricky. Deep water in places, shallower fords in others, Persian cavalry in gleaming ranks on the far side, lances angled down toward the river, clearly hoping that the Macedonians would try to force a crossing straight into a wall of men and horses. Their plan hinged on one assumption. No sane commander would throw his best troops into a fast river against an enemy already in good order on the opposite bank. So if Alexander was sane, they had time. They expected him to camp nearby, scout further up and down the river, maybe wait until morning to try a crossing elsewhere. They expected this to become a game of patience and maneuver before steel met flesh. Alexander did something else. Ancient accounts disagree exactly who said what in that war council on the near bank. Some suggest his older, more cautious officers urged him to wait until dawn, to cross in safety and fight the Persians on equal ground. But whatever arguments were made, the decision he owned was simple and shocking. They would attack now in the late light, with the river at its current strength and the enemy already in their chosen positions. Under most circumstances, that would be madness. Under these, it was a calculated bet on psychology, training, and surprise. Macedonian infantry formed up in their blocks a little back from the water. The Thessalian cavalry anchored one wing. On the other side, Alexander placed his companion cavalry, the aristocratic spearhead of his army, along with other horse, including the Paeonians and Prodromoi, the runners ahead, lighter troops used for reconnaissance and sudden strikes. He didn't lead with the phalanx, he led with the cavalry. The first wave into the Granicus was not the main companion charge, but a probing force, light horsemen and some attached elements, moving in at an angle against the Persian left. Their purpose was not to win the battle alone, it was to disrupt, to draw javelins and lances, to make the men on the opposite bank commit themselves, step forward, project their lines down toward the river, instead of waiting comfortably above it. Once that dance began, Alexander took his place. He rode on the right, at the head of the companion cavalry, wearing armour distinctive enough that friend and enemy alike could track his movement. Ancient authors relish the details. Shining helmet with white plumes, his cloak, his horse, probably Bucephalus, surging through the current with him. This was not staged bravery for a distant audience. It was real, tactical risk. To cross a river into a prepared enemy is to accept a few brutal facts. Your formation will break up as men and horses pick their way through deeper and shallower spots. Some will slip. Shields will be misaligned, spears tangled. When you reach the far bank, you will be climbing, not standing steady. The men waiting above you will have higher ground, a clearer swing, a cleaner thrust. Alexander trusted that his companion cavalry, drilled in charges, in wheeling manoeuvres, in following his signal almost instinctively, could absorb that chaos and turn it into motion rather than disaster. The clash on the bank was vicious. Horses crashed against horses chest to chest, hooves slipping on wet mud, men leaning forward with lances aimed at faces, throats, the gaps between plates and leather. Macedonian riders tried to gain space to use their ziston, the long-thrusting spear of their cavalry. Persian nobles sought to close and unhorse them, to hack at exposed arms and necks. Here, in this maelstrom, Alexander came closer to death than in almost any later, larger battle. Several traditions preserve the same core scene. He presses forward too far or simply finds himself momentarily isolated by the shifting tide of horses. A Persian noble, some sources name him Ruzakes, rides at him, weapon raised. Alexander strikes first, cutting down into the man's helmet and wounding him, but another, possibly Spithridates, closes in on Alexander's exposed side. Spithridates lifts his weapon, some say a sword, some say a kind of axe, for a killing blow aimed at the young king's unprotected head or neck. What saves Alexander is not his own speed this time, but the presence of a companion whose entire job in that instant is to be closer than death. Clytus, later remembered as Clytus the Black, sees the danger and acts with the unthinking decisiveness of someone who has spent years training and fighting beside this leader. He swings and severs Spithridates' arm mid-strike, cutting short the arc that could have ended the campaign, the legend, and possibly Macedonian dominance in a single, almost invisible moment. Many details of that exchange are debated. The exact names, the sequence, the angle of the blows, these are reconstructed from literary sources written down long after the event, coloured by admiration and hindsight. But the broader truth is consistent. Alexander exposed himself in the thickest fighting and survived only with help. Heroism and dependence intertwined. While that drama played out at the water's edge, the rest of the battlefield was shifting. The Macedonian line did what it was designed to do, turn initial contact into a rolling coordinated pressure. As more companion cavalry and supporting units gained the far bank, the Persians' initial advantage of position began to erode. They had committed heavily to the front line. Once that line became entangled, it was hard to withdraw cleanly, harder still to redeploy the mercenary infantry behind them into a new, coherent front nearer the river. Meanwhile, Macedonian infantry began their own crossing in good order, protected by the cavalry screen. Phalangites waded through, raising their long sarissas once ashore, knitting themselves into the dense hedges of spear points that made frontal attacks so costly. Hyperspists, more flexible, moved where gaps opened, anchoring places where cavalry could not hold indefinitely. At some point in this evolving melee, the Persian cavalry's confidence buckled. There was no single trumpet note of collapse we can point to, just the gradual accumulation of unfavourable conditions. No room to manoeuvre backward without trampling their own infantry, mounting casualties among high-status nobles near the front. The slow but relentless Macedonian push-up onto the bank. When that front line finally gave way and horsemen began to peel off or flee in earnest, the carefully arrayed Greek mercenaries behind them found themselves suddenly exposed. Here, the ancient accounts diverge most sharply, and modern historians argue hardest. One tradition has Alexander offering these Greek infantry terms to surrender before or after the Persian flight. Another, harsher version, describes him turning the full weight of his phalanx and cavalry onto them, slaughtering thousands in a grim, deliberate demonstration, the numbers recorded, tens of thousands killed on one side, only a few dozen on the other, strain belief and probably include exaggeration, simplification, or propaganda. What seems likely is this: the mercenaries fought hard, as professionals do when trapped with little hope of orderly withdrawal. The Macedonians, fired by the momentum of victory, pressed their advantage. Casualties were heavy among the Greeks serving Persia, and not merely incidental. Alexander had political reasons to be ruthless. These men represented in his narrative traitors to the Hellenic cause, Greeks who had taken Persian pay instead of joining the so-called Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge. Harsh treatment of them sent a message back across the Aegean: choose your side carefully. It also told the Persian court something: your money cannot always buy you safety. As for the famous casualty counts, roughly 1,000 or so Macedonians dead, versus something like 20,000 enemy losses, depending on which ancient author you consult, most modern scholars treat them with caution. Ancient writers liked clean, lopsided numbers. Victors liked to downplay their own losses and inflate those of the defeated. Battlefield archaeology has not given us a firm corrective for Granicus. What's clear is direction, not exact totals. Macedonian losses were real but sustainable. Persian losses, especially in experienced cavalry and mercenaries, hurt. By early night, the shouting and clashing had faded. The field on the far side of the Granicus was in Macedonian hands. Persian satraps who had hoped to write triumph letters to their king were dead or fleeing inland. Their strategy of stopping Alexander at the water's edge had failed in its first, best test. Militarily, the battle was significant but not yet apocalyptic. No king of kings had fought in person. No imperial heartland had been touched. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from Anatolia to India, could, in theory, raise fresh armies and appoint new satraps. Psychologically, the shock was far greater. For Greek cities watching from a distance, the news that Alexander had crossed into Asia met the first major Persian force almost immediately, and driven it from the field, confirmed that this was not a doomed adventure. For the Macedonian soldiers themselves, it showed that their training and faith in their young king paid off even in the most unfavourable terrain. For Persian administrators, the message was sharper and more corrosive. A relatively small expeditionary force, led by a man barely out of his teens, had just assaulted a fortified river position, the sort of place that should have blunted any invader and broken the satrapic coalition. Local elites who had banked on the empire's untarnished aura of invincibility now had to consider a new possibility. Resistance might fail, and accommodation might be safer. Word of Granicus would travel along the same roads that had once carried the satrap's summons. Only now, the stories moving with the messengers were different. They were stories of a Macedonian line forcing its way through cold water, of Persian nobles cut down at close quarters, of Greek mercenaries slaughtered or captured. Some of those stories grew in the telling. Some were tailored by Alexander's own propagandist to craft an image: the bold river crosser, the fearless king, the avenger of Greece. Later generations would argue about which details were literal fact and which were sculpted legend. But on that evening beside the Granicus, before the legends hardened, the reality for everyone present was simpler. The river had seemed a shield. It had not been enough. And from that single crack in Persia's western armour, the gates of Asia would begin, slowly at first and then with dizzying speed, to open. In the days after the battle, the river stopped being a line on a map and became a memory. The men who had crossed it with lances up could point back and say, "We were there." The men who had hoped it would hold the invader could only look inland and think about the next barrier, the next excuse. Western Asia Minor was a patchwork, not a single block of loyal territory. Persian satraps held formal authority, but beneath them were layers of cities, estates, temples, and local dynasts, each with their own fears and grudges. When word of Granicus arrived, it did not land on a united front. It fell into this mosaic. Some communities reacted immediately. Cities that had long resented Persian tax demands or the presence of garrisons now had a new calculation to make. If Alexander was really marching inland, if he had already killed or scattered the coalition that was supposed to stop him at the border, then staying openly loyal to the King of Kings began to feel less like prudence and more like placing a bet on a horse that had already stumbled out of the gate. So as Alexander's army moved south along the coast and then inland through Anatolia's western satrapies, doors did something interesting. Some slammed shut, others creaked open just enough to listen. At places like Sardis, the old Lydian capital that had become a Persian administrative hub, resistance evaporated faster than anyone could have predicted months earlier. The satraps' representatives weighed their options. Attempt to hold the city with limited forces against an undefeated army, whose king rode at the front line, or negotiate. Alexander took advantage of this, accepting surrender, confirming local laws, promising to respect the rights and customs of the city. Where a hard siege might have broken walls and hearts, a swift, generous settlement instead broke Persian control. Elsewhere, where Persian officials thought they still had a chance, the story unfolded more slowly. Some fortresses and cities still had strong garrisons, especially on the coast, where imperial strategy had always leaned heavily on naval power. Here, Alexander's earlier decision not to face the Persian fleet head-on began to shape everything. On paper, Persia controlled the sea. Its navy, drawn from Phoenician, Cypriot and other maritime subjects, could outnumber anything Macedon and its Greek allies could currently float. If Alexander took his army too far inland without securing key harbours and coastal cities, that fleet could raid his homeland, cut off his reinforcements from Europe, and support revolts behind him. He could not conjure a stronger navy out of thin air, so he chose a different way to fight a naval war, with marching feet instead of ships' hulls. His route after Granicus hugged the coastline repeatedly, not because he wanted sea breezes, but because every harbour he took from Persian control was one less potential base for the enemy fleet. At cities that hosted Persian naval stations like Miletus and Halicarnassus, he could not simply rely on shock and negotiation. Their commanders understood their importance. They had ships nearby and loyalists inside. They could hope, if they held on long enough, that Persian aid would arrive from the sea and turn the tables. So Alexander laid siege. Siege in this period was not a quick cinematic moment. It was grinding, technical, and often ugly. Engineers moved up with the army, men accustomed to calculating angles, raising towers, building rams, and filling in ditches under a storm of missiles. Alexander did not shy away from this type of warfare. He walked his men through it. He ordered the construction of siege engines, brought them against walls that had felt impervious for generations, and kept up the pressure even when the first attempts faltered. At Miletus, he combined on-land operations with his smaller allied fleet to squeeze the harbour. At Halicarnassus, a tougher nut, he faced determined Persian commanders who launched sorties, burned his machines, tried to turn the siege into a prolonged war of attrition. Eventually, though, the pattern that would become familiar in this campaign emerged. Alexander was willing to invest time and blood to pry out these coastal strongholds. He understood that until the harbours fell, the empire's naval shadow would follow him. Inside the Greek cities of Asia Minor, people watched how he treated each new capture with anxious care. Alexander had come across the Aegean proclaiming a war of revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece, and presenting himself as champion of Greek freedom. This was not just rhetoric for his own men. It was an instrument he aimed directly at the communities he now approached. Where a city was Greek in language and culture, and had been under loose or tight Persian control for decades, he offered a script. Throw out the Persian garrison if you have one. Welcome me at the gate. Acknowledge me and the League of Corinth as your new overlord, at least formally. In return, your laws and institutions will be respected. You will be declared free from tribute to Susa, from the permanent presence of Persian troops, from certain forms of interference. In practice, this freedom was selective. Alexander still demanded strategic control, still left Macedonian governors or garrisons where he judged them necessary. But the language mattered. Decrees were issued liberating the cities. Exiled pro-Macedonian or anti-Persian factions were recalled. Those who had collaborated most closely with the Persian administration were often punished or sidelined, sometimes violently. The message spread through proclamations, and the stories of returning exiles was clear. To stand with Persia was to stand with the past. To welcome Alexander was to join the winning future. At the same time, he made sure that no one mistook him for a soft-handed guest afraid to hurt feelings. The violence at Granicus against Greek mercenaries in Persian service had been one signal. Harsh punishments for cities or leaders who resisted too long were another. The role he crafted for himself in these first months was deliberately double-edged. Liberator of the Greeks, hammer of the Persians, judge over those who had, in his framing, chosen the wrong side of that line. Inscriptions and later accounts hint at the care with which his propaganda was shaped. He did not simply win battles. He announced what those victories meant. Temples received offerings dedicated to freedom. Envoys carried home versions of the story that emphasized his piety, his courage, his role as avenger. The more Greek cities accepted this narrative, the more isolated Persian officials became, even in regions where their formal authority still held. But beneath the triumphant arc of these early campaigns, the empire Alexander was fighting remained, for now, mostly intact. The heartland of Persia, the plateau, the great capitals deeper in Asia, the core administrative and military resources of the Achaemenid state had not yet been directly threatened. Darius III was still on his throne. He could still draw on the manpower of many peoples and the wealth of many provinces. Western Asia Minor, though valuable and symbolically important, was a frontier zone compared to the rich river valleys of Mesopotamia or the core Iranian plateau. Even in Anatolia itself, some Persian satraps and loyalists retreated rather than surrender, consolidating their positions inland, hoping that time and distance would work in their favour. They assumed that the empire's unmatched depth, the ability to raise new armies from distant provinces and pull its enemies farther and farther from their base, would eventually counterbalance one young invader's astonishing beginning. From Alexander's campfires, the story looked different. One battle won. Several major cities surrendered or taken. Coastal strongholds reduced or under threat. A growing list of allies and subjects who, only months before, had written their taxes to Persian treasuries. From Susa and Babylon, if reports even arrived in coherent form, it might have looked like something else. A serious but localized disturbance, the kind of crisis that a great empire with patience and the right general could still absorb. The gates of Western Asia had begun to open. Yes. But they opened onto a long road, not a short hallway. Beyond the surrendered cities and captured harbours, beyond the satrapies that shifted allegiance in a season, there still lay the main strength of the Achaemenid world. To reach it, Alexander would have to keep moving, deeper into a system that had been absorbing shocks for 2 centuries, and still, in its own view, expected to outlast this one. As the months turned, the outline of Alexander's campaign stopped looking like a single thrust, and more like a careful stitching along the edge of an enormous fabric. The Aegean coast, the strip of western Anatolia that had been the empire's front porch facing Greece, was now mostly in his hands. But maps are deceptive things. On parchment, the distance from the Aegean to the Levant is a few fingers' width. On the ground, it is mountain chains and high plateaus, river valleys and winter storms. It is time. The deeper Alexander went into Asia Minor, the more he began fighting not just satraps and city councils, but space itself. In summer, Anatolia could feel familiar enough to a Macedonian. Hot days, dry hills, the smell of dust and scrub. In autumn and early winter it became something else. Rains turned roads into mud. Cold winds swept down from the Anatolian plateau, biting through cloaks and into joints. Supply routes that looked straightforward on a strategist's tablet became thin threads stretched across bad weather, local politics and sheer mileage. An army like Alexander's ate an unbelievable amount every day. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of horses, pack animals, camp followers, grain, fodder, wine, oil, salt. For a while the coastal cities and rich river valleys could feed them, willingly or not. But as he marched inland toward Phrygia and then beyond, he could no longer count on friendly ports and warehouses stacked with Persian tribute. So another kind of campaign unfolded in parallel with the marches and sieges, the quiet, continuous work of logistics. Quartermasters went ahead, bargaining with villages, threatening where bargaining failed, trying to secure grain before others could hide or burn it. As the army crossed higher ground, they learned to calculate how far until the next river, the next cluster of settlements, the next chance to restock. Pack trains lengthened. Herds of livestock were driven along with the column, living supplies on the hoof. When they could, they used existing Persian roads, those engineered veins of empire, but those had been built to connect satrapal centres with the royal heartland, not to make life easy for invaders. Bridges might be destroyed, way stations stripped. For the rank and file, the strain of this long road showed up in more immediate ways. Boots wore through. Cloaks that had been enough on the beaches of Ionia suddenly seemed thin as gauze on frosty mornings. Men who had marched out of Macedon with shining new gear now patched their tunics with whatever cloth they could scavenge. Horses, pushed hard in battle and on forced marches, fell lame or died. Replacements trickled in from Europe, but every month of distance made that trickle thinner. To many in the camp, the war might have started to feel like an endless horizon. Each new satrapy had its own governor, its own promises of loyalty, its own murmurs of possible revolt. Each pass taken revealed another ridge beyond. Somewhere far to the east of this moving column, in the palaces of the inner empire, the man who was still, in law and ceremony, its centre began to treat the Macedonian problem as something he had to face himself. Darius III had not been on the field at Granicus. That battle had been handled badly by Western satraps and a coalition of local forces. Their failure, and the speed with which Alexander turned that failure into political collapse along the coast, made something clear in Susa, in Babylon, in the royal residences along the so-called Royal Road. This was no longer an incident, it was a war. Sources from later Greek and Roman writers, coloured by hindsight and triumph, like to present Darius as hesitant, indecisive, almost doomed from the start. The reality, as far as we can reconstruct it, is less theatrical and more understandable. The Achaemenid king was master of a system designed to deal with rebel satraps, nomad raiders, and border skirmishes, not young foreign kings who cut straight through 3 provinces in a campaigning season. To answer that kind of threat properly, he needed time. He called on that deeper reservoir of the empire. Orders went out along the roads to distant satrapies. Men were levied from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, from the uplands of Iran, from subject peoples as far away as the eastern frontiers. Nobles were summoned with their retainers, cavalry units mustered from the proud horse-breeding regions that had long provided the empire's armoured backbone. Greek mercenaries, the same type of professionals Alexander had butchered at Granicus, were hired in new batches. Chariots with scythed wheels were prepared, those intimidating demonstrations of wealth and ancient prestige. The army that began to form around Darius was not just large, it was royal. Its presence, wherever it marched, carried the weight of imperial ceremony. Standards, musicians, the king's household, his family, his court officials. By deciding to lead this host himself, Darius was doing more than committing troops. He was tying his personal authority and honour to the outcome. He had to choose where to use this weapon. On the map, western Anatolia, already scarred by Alexander's passage, seemed like dangerous ground to commit the king in person. The invader was closer to his own base, and the satrapal structure there had already buckled. So Darius looked southward and eastward, toward the line of Syria and Cilicia. the narrow land bridge between Anatolia and the Levant. If he could position himself there, he could block further advance while Alexander was still wrung out from his first campaign season. Let the Macedonian stretch his supply lines through mountain passes, then strike. Meanwhile, Alexander pushed on. Through the old Phrygian centres, accepting surrender where he could, storming where he had to, he made for the Cilician Gates, a narrow pass that cut through the Taurus mountains toward the warm plains beyond. Ancient writers loved this phrase, gates, and in this case the metaphor matched the lived experience. The road squeezed between steep slopes where a determined enemy could have forced him to pay for every yard in blood. But Darius, still assembling his full strength further east, did not block him there. Alexander passed the Taurus, descended into Cilicia, and for a brief moment the strain of the march lifted. The climate softened. He entered Tarsus, a rich city on the Cydnus River. The campaign paused. Men bathed in cold water that, according to later stories, nearly cost Alexander his life through illness. Whether that tale is embroidered or not, it hints at a real truth. Fatigue and exposure were as much enemies now as any satrap. Then, once recovered, he pushed further, along the curve of the coast towards Syria and the city of Issus. Issus itself was not a great metropolis, not a name that would have meant much outside its region before this year. Its importance was geographical, not cultural. Picture the map here like a funnel. To the north and west stretches the bulk of Anatolia, the land he'd just crossed. To the south, the long line of the Levantine coast, and beyond that, Egypt. Between them lies Cilicia, a narrow corridor hemmed in by the sea on one side and rough mountains on the other. Issus sat near the neck of this corridor, where coastal plain, foothills, and a small river came together. Behind it, a series of passes and rough tracks threaded through the Amanus mountains toward the interior of Syria and the broader plains where a huge army would have room to deploy. In front of it, the shoreline bent in such a way that marching past without noticing anything unusual would be difficult. It was a place where paths converged almost by accident. Alexander, having crossed into Cilicia, originally expected to meet Darius somewhere further east, on those wider Syrian plains. The idea of facing the great king was no longer abstract. Reports from scouts and local informants were now filled with details, numbers of troops, types of cavalry, rumours of chariots, whispers that Darius was finally in motion with the full majesty of his empire behind him. For the Macedonian camp the mood must have shifted. This was no satrap's levy they were walking toward. This was the king whose name had been invoked in every proclamation, every accusation, every promise of revenge. The first months in Asia had been a story of cutting away the empire's outlying fingers. Now, somewhere ahead, was the hand itself. The manoeuvring that brought the two kings suddenly close did not unfold, as either side had drawn it on their mental maps. Darius, advancing westward with his vast host, heard that Alexander had pushed down into Cilicia and then moved south along the coast. Rather than wait further east and risk the Macedonians slipping past him into the rich Levant, he apparently decided on a bold move. He would swing north through the mountain passes behind Alexander's position, cut him off from his line back into Anatolia, and force him to fight with his back to the sea in a constricted space. For a brief span of days, each army marched, expecting the other to be somewhere else. Alexander moved eastward from Issus, hoping to find Darius on open ground. Darius moved north and west through the interior routes, emerging near Issus after Alexander had already passed by. The invader and the defender, each trying to turn the other's flank, in effect traded places along the same narrow corridor. When word finally reached Alexander that the great king was not in front of him but behind, camped near Issus where his own sick and wounded had been left, the campaign that had been measured in long marches and strategic calculations suddenly contracted into a single, urgent line. He wheeled his army around. The road he had just travelled became, in reverse, the road to a decision. Now the geography that had seemed like a difficulty, those hemmed-in plains, the river cutting across the narrow strip of flat land between mountain and sea, became something else. Alexander realized that, surprisingly, Darius had placed his larger army in a choke point. Whatever advantage the king enjoyed in sheer numbers would be blunted by the terrain. The great royal host, with all its pomp and potential, would have to funnel through a limited front, with the mountains at their back and only a narrow escape to the open plains beyond. Night would have fallen over those camps with different feelings. In the Persian lines near Issus, the presence of Darius himself in his splendid pavilion, surrounded by nobles and royal guards, must have seemed reassuring. The invader was cut off, they thought. The path back to Anatolia lay through the king. The empire had finally turned to face this upstart directly. In Alexander's camp there was the awareness that the long approach was over. No more fighting proxies, no more chasing satraps through provincial capitals. Ahead lay the first meeting of king against king, of a 20-something Macedonian who had never lost a battle against a monarch whose very title, King of Kings, implied layers of power and tradition behind him. The road through Asia Minor had been a test of distance, weather and will, a process of peeling back the empire's outer skin. At Issus, in a narrow strip of land between mountain and sea, that long diffuse struggle was about to collapse into one compressed, violent moment. 2 armies, 2 kings, one corridor of land that neither could now easily abandon. The next day the maps would change again, but not yet. For now they waited in the dark, listening to the sea and the wind in the passes, each side knowing that when the sun rose the question that had been hanging over every mile marched would finally be asked on a single field. Morning at Issus did not dawn onto a vast plain full of manoeuvre and sweeping vistas. It opened onto a bottleneck. When Alexander's scouts reported the exact ground Darius had chosen, what they described was almost disappointingly small for such enormous reputations. The sea on one side, rising foothills and rough ground on the other. Between them, a narrow strip of usable land, squeezed further by the Pinarus River cutting across it at an angle before turning toward the shoreline. This was where the great king had decided to meet him, not on some wide Mesopotamian field where tens of thousands of troops could spread their wings, but in a corridor where ankles would be in water or mud and the flanking space for cavalry was scarce. Ancient authors list Darius's numbers in extravagant terms, hundreds of thousands, sometimes into the realm of fantasy. Modern historians, stripping away the glory, suggest something far less impossible. Perhaps Darius outnumbered Alexander 2 or 3 to 1, enough to feel powerful, not enough to be a human ocean. But more important than the exact count was the fact that most of those men could not actually fit into the fighting line at once. Imagine trying to pour a lake through a garden hose. The Persian host, impressive in camp, could not all stand shoulder to shoulder between mountain and sea. The front rank might be thickened, the rear might be several men deep, but beyond a certain point, extra soldiers were simply standing behind other bodies, their spears and arrows without clear targets, their mass more psychological than practical. Alexander read this in a glance. He had trained his army to move as a thinking creature, one that understood space. On broad plains, numbers could turn into encirclements, extended lines, the slow suffocation of smaller forces. Here, the geometry was different. He could meet the royal army's front with something close to parity, at least where it mattered most. Darius, for his part, arranged his line in the way that had served Persian kings for generations. He took the centre, as tradition and prestige demanded, surrounded by his royal guard with Greek mercenary infantry, hard veterans hired at great expense, anchoring the middle. Cavalry spread out toward the flanks where the ground allowed, especially on the seaward side where beach and flatland merged. The Macedonians deployed with a kind of practised inevitability. The phalanx, those dense files of pikemen, formed the core, shields overlapping, sarissas jutting out like a moving field of thorns. Light troops, archers and javelin men were scattered where they could harass and plug gaps. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion with cavalry and infantry had the less glamorous, more frightening task. Hold, even if pushed back, keep the line from being rolled up along the shore. On the right, where Alexander took his place personally, was the sharp edge. The companion cavalry clustered around him, elite horsemen who, by now, moved with him like a limb he could direct by instinct. Nearby, some of his best infantry. If the field could be broken open anywhere, it would be here, under his direct eye. The battle did not begin as a charge so much as a negotiation with the river. The Pinarus was not huge, not some raging torrent, but it was enough to fragment neat lines. The Persians held the far bank, many of their infantry drawn up on a slight rise beyond, giving them the advantage of higher ground and the footing of dry earth. As the Macedonian phalanx moved forward, they had to descend, cross water, and climb under missile fire. Arrows and javelins fell into the advancing ranks. Men slipped on stones, were pulled upright by comrades, adjusted their sarissas in the press. For a moment, the great Macedonian machine was not a machine at all, just individuals trying to keep formation, while the ground tugged at their legs and fear tugged at their concentration. When they made contact, it was ugly. No textbook collision of perfect lines. Phalanx blocks came up out of the river at angles, some ahead, some lagging. The Greek mercenaries on Darius's side, well drilled and motivated by both pay and prestige, fought fiercely. The Macedonian centre bent. Alexander's line, for a time, did not look like the steady, unbroken front he liked to imagine when he talked about tactics with his officers. It looked like something that might crack. This is where his battle pattern, the one he had been refining since youth, came into play. He did not rush his companions straight into the river wherever it was thickest. Instead, he and the cavalry on his right edged outward, probing, feeling for the places where terrain and deployment had left seams. A small re-entrant in the Persian line, a point where troops were second-rate or thin, a curve along the foothills where the royal army's careful arrangement became less precise. As the phalanx in the centre locked the Persians into the brutal contest over the riverbank, Alexander began to arc his own wings slightly forward and inward. Not a wild wheeling motion, but a controlled, aggressive advance focused on one section of the enemy front. This created a characteristic shape. The Macedonian line did not remain perfectly straight. It developed an angle, with Alexander's right thrusting ahead, his centre engaged, and his left more pressured, leaning backward under Persian cavalry attacks near the sea. From above, if we could have hovered there unseen, it would have looked like a set of jaws. One side biting in, the other straining not to be pried open. Near Darius, in the centre, information would have come in fragments. Reports of success on one wing, trouble on another, dust and shouting, the visible anchor of his Greek mercenaries holding their ground. At first it might have seemed manageable. The Macedonian centre had been checked, even driven back in places. On the shoreward side, Parmenion was under heavy pressure, his men giving ground. There were moments when the Persian cavalry on that flank looked close to breaking through, close to curling around the Macedonian rear, but the centre of gravity was shifting quietly toward Alexander's point of attack. The companions, having found their opening, crossed the river not as an extended line but as a concentrated wedge. They smashed through local opposition, then immediately turned inward, aiming not at some abstract strategic point, but at the stretch of line where Darius and his household troops stood. This was not an accident. Persian royal protocol put the king visibly at the centre of the array. Glory demanded it, ceremony framed it, and Alexander targeted it. If he could not annihilate the whole army in this constricted space, he could at least try to break its mind. We do not have a precise, minute-by-minute account of what Darius saw in that moment. Later, Greek and Roman writers draw him in broad strokes. The king, suddenly noticing Alexander bearing down on him, gripped by panic, turning his chariot and fleeing at the first sign of danger. It is a scene tailored to moralizing history, the cowardly monarch contrasted with the fearless young conqueror. Reality was probably more complicated. A royal centre in trouble does not just affect one man. It ripples through the command structure, through personal guards, through nobles whose status and safety are tied to their proximity to the throne. What we can say with some confidence is this: as Alexander's cavalry broke through and angled toward the heart of the Persian line, the coherence around Darius cracked. Whether the king himself made a conscious decision to withdraw early, or whether the swirl of panic, injured horses, wounded attendants and collapsing units simply swept him away, his chariot pulled back from the immediate danger. At some point he abandoned that chariot altogether and escaped on horseback. In the compressing, choking space of Issus, that movement, one man and his retinue disengaging from the centre, had outsized consequences. To thousands watching from nearby, it looked like the axle on which the whole army turned had suddenly rolled backward. In systems built on personal authority, perception is as lethal as spears. When the royal banner was seen moving away, when the rumour that the king is leaving began to race along the line, what had been a strained but organised resistance began to fray. The Greek mercenaries in the centre, who fought hard and lost heavily, seemed to have held longer than many others, perhaps because they were less emotionally tied to the king's presence. But to the Persian contingents, to levies whose courage depended on the image of Darius still standing firm, that image dissolved. The Macedonian push became a tear, then a widening rip. Units broke. Men tried to flee toward the narrow exits behind them, only to find their own depth working against them. There was not much open ground for a graceful staged retreat. There was only the sea on one side, rough slopes on the other, and a narrow path back through the way they had come. Amid that chaos, something happened that would matter far beyond the day's casualty lists. In the Persian camp reached as the line crumbled, Alexander's men found Darius's mother, his wife, and his children. The king, in withdrawing, had not managed, or not planned, to evacuate his immediate family. In Achaemenid culture, this was not just a private disaster, it was a public wound. The royal household was part of the fabric of kingship itself, symbols of continuity and legitimacy. For the Macedonians to seize them was to gain living hostages, but also something more intangible, a sense that the great king's aura of invulnerability had been punctured. Accounts of what followed stress Alexander's calculated restraint. He treated the royal women with courtesy, insisted they be addressed by their proper titles, even, according to some stories, went out of his way to reassure Darius's mother about her son's safety. Whether every detail is true or polished by propaganda, the broader message is clear. He wanted the world to see him not as a simple ravager, but as a man now dealing, almost as an equal, with the dynasty he was dismantling. Did Issus break Persian confidence, or did it merely bend the shape of the war? In the immediate aftermath, the psychological blow was enormous. A king who had ridden to face the invader with all the pomp of the empire had been forced to flee, leaving his family and much of his baggage behind. Satraps and cities watching from a distance would have taken note of who was now in possession of the royal women, the royal trappings, the royal story. Yet the Achaemenid Empire did not evaporate after Issus. Its core territories, its treasuries, its deep reserves of manpower remained intact. Darius, humiliated but alive, still had the ability to raise armies, to move to the vast plains further east where his numbers could breathe. The war, in a structural sense, was not over. It had simply been pushed into a new phase, away from the cramped corridors of Cilicia and toward the open spaces for which the Persians had always preferred to fight. Ancient writers, especially those narrating from the Macedonian side, sometimes present Issus as a kind of preordained triumph, a morality play about courage versus cowardice. They inflate Persian numbers to impossible heights. They condense the complex unwinding of a massive army into a single moment of royal flight. They smooth over the near breaking of the Macedonian centre and the desperate pressure on Parmenian's wing. Modern historians, squinting through those layers of exaggeration, are more cautious. They point out that we do not know exact troop totals, that casualty figures are suspect, that Darius's personal motives in leaving the field remain partly guesswork. They remind us that the Persians adapted after Issus. that the next great battle would not be fought in another bottleneck, but on a plain chosen deliberately to let the empire's scale tell. Still, even with all those caveats, something fundamental changed in that narrow place where mountain met sea. Alexander now had not just a string of victories over satrapal forces, but a battlefield where he could say, "I faced the King of Kings and he ran." He had in his hands the king's mother, wife and children, a set of living bargaining chips and a powerful symbol of reversed fortunes. And Darius, somewhere eastward, had to plan his next move with the knowledge that his opponent had seen the centre of the royal army quiver and yield. From the cramped killing ground of Issus, both men would now turn their eyes south and east. The coastal road led towards cities that had not yet decided whom they truly feared more. Beyond those, the empire's heartland waited, still rich, still vast, but with a new hairline fracture running through its confidence. Alexander did not sprint toward the heart of Asia after Issus. On a map, it might look tempting. Eastward, the road uncoiled toward Mesopotamia, toward Babylon and the great treasuries. The king who had run could be pursued across the plains, harried until he was forced into another battle. Many later readers imagine Alexander standing on the shore of Cilicia, eyes already fixed on the Tigris. But when he looked out from those coastal hills, he saw something else: the sea. The Achaemenid Empire was not just a land of roads and caravan tracks. It was also a web of sea routes that tied together Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Cyprus and Egypt. Persian power had always relied on other people's ships. Phoenician and Greek fleets that could move troops, threaten coasts, raid supply lines. Alexander's own homeland had felt that pressure during the Persian invasions of Greece, when a royal navy had skirted the Aegean like a drawn blade. Now, after Issus, that navy still existed. The satraps of the western coast had lost battles, but their harbours and islands remained. Persian admirals could still sail behind Alexander, stir up rebellion in Greece, cut the tenuous line of communication that ran back through Asia Minor to Macedon. So long as key ports in the eastern Mediterranean flew the King of Kings banner, the war was not a straight road. It was a trap that could snap shut behind him. So he did something that, in hindsight, looks deceptively simple. He decided to take the sea away. This did not mean building a rival navy from scratch. It meant walking down the coastline and breaking every link in the chain that held the Persian maritime network together. Cities that submitted would be spared. Cities that resisted would become examples. The strategy was brutally logical. If you control every harbour, every anchorage that matters, the enemy's fleet becomes a set of homeless hulls with nowhere safe to winter, resupply or recrew. Ships without ports are like horses without fodder. They can run for a while, then they tire and scatter. Many places understood this quickly. After Issus, coastal cities in Syria and Phoenicia opened their gates, changing flags with a kind of wary pragmatism. Better to proclaim loyalty to the victorious young king than to be besieged in a war that might no longer be winnable. Alexander accepted their pledges, confirmed their local elites in office, presented himself as the new protector of their old arrangements. But one city stood in the way like a stone hammered into the shoreline: Tyre. To its inhabitants, it was more than a city. It was a tradition of seafaring older than the Macedonian kingdom itself, a place whose ships had once explored the fringes of the known world, whose colonies dotted distant coasts, whose craftsmen and purple dyers were names in royal courts from Egypt to Babylon. To Persia, Tyre was a jewel of the Western Sea, a naval base, a symbol of Phoenician loyalty. To Alexander, it was a problem that could not be walked around. The problem had two parts. First, Tyre was rich and proud enough to believe it could negotiate between great kings rather than simply obey. Second, the main city was not on the shore at all. It sat on an island a short distance off the coast, ringed by strong walls that dropped almost directly into the water. His first move was not to bring up rams or engines. It was to send envoys. The Tyrians listened politely and offered a compromise. Alexander could be honoured, but Darius would not be openly spurned. Tyrannizing over centuries of careful political balance was not in their interest. They would prefer to be neutral in this struggle between distant monarchs. For a land general who needed total control of the coast, neutrality was not enough. A city that could shelter Persian squadrons or simply close its harbours at inconvenient times was a risk he could not afford. So diplomacy gave way to engineering. Standing on the mainland, looking out at that island, someone had an idea that has echoed through military history ever since. If the city is in the sea, make the sea into land. Alexander ordered a causeway to be built. Stones, rubble, timber, earth, all dumped into the shallow waters between shore and island, extending outward bit by bit. It was a slow, grinding process. Tyrian ships harassed the workers. Winter storms tore at the new-made spit. The defenders lashed out with fireships and missile fire. Macedonian engineers responded with towers on the mole, with protective structures with counterfires. Day after day, men waded waist-deep, heaving rocks under arrows and sling stones. What had begun as a problem of strategy became an ordeal of will. The siege of Tyre lasted months. Ancient sources writing from the Macedonian side emphasize its eventual fall and the astonishing feat of that completed causeway, a permanent scar that would change the coastline for centuries. Modern historians also look at the other detail those sources preserve, the aftermath. When Tyre finally fell, the punishment was severe. Thousands killed, many others sold into slavery, a display of crucified men lining the shore if we trust the harsher accounts. Some numbers are probably inflated, some atrocities perhaps shaped by later moralizing. Yet the broad picture is hard to ignore. Alexander, the young king who had treated Darius's family with public courtesy after Issus, showed another face here. The commander for whom resistance, especially strategic resistance, would be crushed in ways meant to be remembered. From one point of view, this was cold, calculated terror, a message to every remaining coastal city and island. Do not force me to do this again. From another, it was the decision of a man who had now tied his own fate to a campaign far bigger than any one battle. He could not leave fortresses at his back. Gaza, further south, would hear that message and still decide to test him. Unlike Tyre, Gaza was not an island. It sat on high ground near the desert's edge, a fortified outpost on the route into Egypt. Controlling it meant securing the southern end of the Levantine corridor, sealing off Persian movement between Syria and the Nile Valley. For Darius, as long as Gaza held, there was at least a doorway through which troops and influence might still flow. For Alexander, it was a lock that had to be turned before he could step into the land of the pharaohs. The city's commander, Baptiste, chose defiance. He had strong walls, a well-stocked garrison, and the knowledge that Alexander's army had already marched and fought hard. He might have hoped that time, casualties, or perhaps some shift in the wider war would force the Macedonians to bypass him. Alexander did not bypass. He circled. The siege that followed was another exercise in earth and blood. Siege ramps crept closer. Towers rolled forward inch by inch. The defenders fought stubbornly. Accounts suggest the Macedonians took significant losses. Here again, Alexander himself was wounded. Each time he put his body into the dangerous work of an assault, he was not just leading by example. He was also gambling the entire campaign on his own continued survival. When Gaza finally fell, the city's fate echoed Tyre's. Slaughter, enslavement, a ruler dragged alive before the conqueror. Later stories tell of a particularly brutal end for Baptiste, his body tied to a chariot and dragged around the walls, an echo, real or invented, of how Achilles treated Hector in Homeric myth. Whether this exact detail happened or not, the existence of the story shows how people were beginning to understand Alexander, not simply as a practical general, but as a man who moved within a drama of heroes and avengers, modelling himself on legendary predecessors. Tyre and Gaza together did more than clear the map behind him. They sealed the eastern Mediterranean. With Phoenician and Levantine ports in his hands, Persian naval power in the region withered. Admirals might still have ships, but their harbours were gone. Without bases for repair, for victualling, for crew replacements, a fleet becomes a fleet in name only. Greek cities watching from across the sea, once threatened by Persian resurgence, now saw that the axis of danger had shifted decisively. And Alexander, having crushed resistance along the coast, could turn toward Egypt not as a raider, but as a master of the approaches. The march south along the coast into the Nile Valley was militarily less dramatic than Issus or Tyre. Politically and symbolically, it was enormous. Egypt had lived under foreign dynasties before, Libyan, Nubian, Persian, and had its own rhythms of acceptance and revolt. For many in the Nile lands, the great king in faraway Susa was an overlord to be endured. A Macedonian arriving as the avenger of Persian domination, proclaiming liberation, could be slotted into a familiar pattern. The new ruler who claims to restore balance, who honours local gods, who presents himself not as an intruder, but as the rightful pharaoh. Alexander understood this, or had advisers who did. In Egypt he did not behave like a mere conqueror passing through. He allowed himself to be crowned as pharaoh, participated in rituals, visited temples. He founded a city, Alexandria, at the meeting point of river and sea, a deliberate new node of power. He also made the famous journey to the oracle at Siwa, where later stories claim the priest addressed him with divine titles, perhaps calling him the son of Zeus Ammon. Here the line between fact and later embellishment is thin. What matters is not whether every detail happened exactly as told, but that by this stage Alexander's image was stretching. To his Macedonian companions he was still the king they had followed from Europe, first among nobles. To Egyptian priests and scribes he could be written into the ancient framework of god-kings. To Greek storytellers, the idea of a mortal edging toward divinity fit comfortably within centuries of myth. Tyre and Gaza had shown what happened to cities that stood in his way. Egypt showed what happened to lands that accepted him and allowed him to step into their symbols. By the time he turned his gaze back east, across deserts and rivers toward the deep heart of Asia, he was no longer just a talented general leading a hard-bitten army. He was a man for whom entire countries could be besieged, punished, or embraced as stages in a narrative that was beginning to reach beyond ordinary kingship. Darius still held the Great Plains, the empire's core still waited, but the path to it now ran along coasts where Persian ships found no welcome, through territories where Alexander appeared alternately as destroyer and deliverer, and under a sky in which, more and more, he allowed others to whisper that perhaps he was not entirely like other men. Egypt did not greet Alexander with storm and iron the way Tyre and Gaza had. When his army crossed the desert approaches and reached Pelusium, the eastern gateway of the Nile, there was no great field battle, no Persian host waiting to throw him back. The satraps in charge of Egypt had already done their calculations. They knew about Issus. They had heard what had happened to Tyre. They understood that Persian fleets could no longer easily reinforce or evacuate them. And they knew something else, something older than Macedon or Persia. Egypt had a long memory of foreign rulers, Assyrians, Libyans, Nubians, Persians. Some had ruled harshly, some had co-opted local elites, some had been thrown out when the Nile Valley rose in revolt. A governor in Memphis or Sais knew that distant kings came and went, but the temples endured, the priesthood endured, the river endured. So when Alexander arrived proclaiming that he came not as the enemy of Egypt, but as the enemy of Persia, it was easier for many of those officials to change the name they toasted than to die for a king far away. Ancient sources describe garrisons surrendering, cities opening their gates, Greek mercenaries in Persian service quietly making arrangements. There may have been pockets of resistance we no longer hear about, skirmishes that never made it into the official stories, but the broad pattern is consistent. Egypt folded rather than shattered. Why? Part of the answer is simple exhaustion. Persian rule there had not always been gentle. Taxes, requisitions, occasional temple desecrations, or perceived sacrilege. These left scars. Revolts had flared before, sometimes with support from Greek cities. For some Egyptians, Alexander's arrival looked less like a conquest and more like an opportunity to remove one overlord with the help of another. Part of it was calculation at the top. The Persian commanders in Egypt did not command the kind of huge field army Darius could gather on the inland plains. To resist meant almost certain defeat, and that defeat, judging from Tyre and Gaza, might be punished with slaughter. To submit might mean retaining your estates, perhaps even keeping your office under a new great king. And part of it was Alexander's own performance. He did something in Egypt that he had done in a smaller way elsewhere along the coast. He stepped into the local script. He accepted the crown of Pharaoh, not as a novelty, but within the old framework of divine kingship. He made offerings to Egyptian gods, not only to Zeus and Athena. In temple reliefs carved under his name, he appears in the traditional double crown, making offerings just as the native pharaohs had, his Macedonian features smoothed into the timeless style of Egyptian art. For the priests, this was familiar. The names on the cartouches might change, the language in the palace might change, but as long as the rituals continued and the temples were funded, the cosmic order, Ma'at, could be said to endure. In this atmosphere of relative acceptance, Alexander began one of the most consequential acts of his career, although its full weight would only be felt long after he was gone. He drew a city on the map. On a stretch of coast west of the Nile's main mouths, near a natural harbour and a narrow strip of land between sea and lake, he ordered a new foundation, Alexandria. Ancient authors tell stories of him pacing the shoreline, outlining the walls in flour or barley, birds sweeping down to eat the grain like an omen. Whether that detail is literal or embroidered, the intent is clear. Alexandria was not a mere camp or fortress. It was a statement, a new Greek-style polis planted in Egyptian soil facing the Mediterranean, a bridge between Nile and sea, between Egypt and the wider Hellenic world. He stocked it with Greeks and Macedonians, but also with locals and other settlers. He arranged for its harbours to be dredged, for warehouses and quarters to be planned. He gave it his name, an act of vanity perhaps, but also of branding. This was meant to last. We know, with the privilege of hindsight, what it became: a capital, a trading hub, the site of libraries and scholars, of lighthouses and theological debates. In Alexander's lifetime, it was only a construction project and an intention. Yet even then, you can see the pattern. He was not just toppling an empire, he was starting to redraw the cultural map of the eastern Mediterranean. And then there was the desert journey. From the lush Nile Valley, Alexander turned west, toward the Siwa oasis and its temple of Ammon, a god whom Greeks equated with Zeus. It was not an obvious military move. It took him away from the main roads, into harsh country where supply was risky. Why go? Ancient writers offer stories. That he sought confirmation from the oracle about his destiny. That he wanted assurance he was truly the son of Zeus Ammon, not merely Philip's heir. That he asked whether all his father's murderers had been punished. That he inquired about his future conquests. The answers, if they were ever recorded honestly, are lost beneath layers of later embellishment. What we have instead is a haze of suggestive fragments. The priest, we're told, greeted him as son of the god. Or perhaps a misheard phrase was taken that way. Or perhaps, afterward, it was politically convenient to say that he had been hailed as divine. Here, belief, propaganda, and mystery blur together. Did Alexander truly think himself a god's son? Perhaps he allowed the idea to lodge in a corner of his mind, half believed, half performed. For a Macedonian raised on Homer, hearing your story echoed in that of Achilles or Heracles was intoxicating. For an Egyptian priesthood used to pharaohs as living gods, addressing the new ruler in divine language was not shocking at all. For Greek cities and Asian subjects, tales of oracles and divine parentage could be useful tools. They made his rule feel inevitable, written in the sky as well as in the ledger. What matters is not whether every word at Siwa happened exactly as later authors claim, but that, after this point, Alexander more openly played with the boundaries between king and something more. Prostration rituals, heroic imagery, a tighter circle around his person, all of these would trouble some of his companions in the years to come. Yet even as he courted the language of divinity, he remained, in practical terms, a commander preparing for the hardest campaign of his life. In Egypt he rested his men. He reorganized garrisons, securing key cities, leaving behind troops who could hold the Nile Valley and the coastal routes. He tapped the treasury resources now at his disposal, paying debts, rewarding followers, funding new equipment. He drew in reinforcements from Macedon and Greece, new phalanx battalions, fresh cavalry, specialists. He also used the time to study what lay ahead. The path eastward from Egypt did not lead directly to Darius. To confront the great king again, Alexander would have to march back through Syria and then turn inland, crossing river systems and open plains toward Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. This was the empire's old core, a region laced with royal roads, dotted with fortified cities, defended by the full might of what the Achaemenid state could still muster. If Issus had been a collision against a cramped shoreline, the next encounter would be different. Darius, given time, would not choose a bottleneck again. He would look for wide terrain where numbers and cavalry could be spread out like a great net. Alexander seems to have understood this. His engineers worked on bridging techniques, siege equipment, the logistics of moving vast quantities of grain and fodder inland. His staff organized supply depots, contracts with local communities, arrangements for river transport where possible. The further he went from the Mediterranean, the longer and more fragile his supply lines would stretch. Every marching column of men and horses was a moving puzzle of calories and water. The scale of what he was about to attempt is easy to underestimate when you trace it with a finger on a small map. From the Nile Delta back up through coastal routes, then turning east, he would lead tens of thousands of people, soldiers, camp followers, specialists, across hundreds of miles into a heartland where every advantage, at least on paper, belonged to his enemy. Darius still commanded the symbolic capital cities, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. He still controlled the royal road network. He could still summon satrapal levies, eastern cavalry, contingents from the depths of his empire. Alexander was betting that the momentum of his past victories, the skill of his army, and the cracks already visible in Persian authority would be enough to balance those odds. Egypt had been a pause, a sideways step, a place where conquest felt almost easy, where crowds had cheered and priests had anointed. Leaving it meant walking back into uncertainty. When he turned his back on the Nile and pointed his spear toward Mesopotamia, he was moving toward more than another battle. He was moving toward a confrontation that would decide whether the Achaemenid Empire remained a wounded giant or became, in a matter of days, something historians would have to start calling former. Ahead lay deserts, rivers, and the immense flat stage on which that decision would be made. By the time Alexander left the cool gardens of the Nile behind and turned his march back through Syria, Darius had already begun his own work of repair. Think for a moment about what it means to be defeated the way he had been at Issus. You're the king of kings, heir to generations of rulers whose faces are carved in stone at Persepolis. Your word moves governors from the Aegean to the Indus. You command a treasury filled with bullion hauled in tribute from dozens of peoples, and then, in a cramped strip of coastal plain, a younger man smashes your army, scatters your guards, seizes your family and sends you galloping into the night. Ancient Greek writers love to dwell on the flight, on the abandoned chariot, on the image of a humiliated king. But what matters for the next chapter is what Darius did after that. He did not vanish. He did not collapse into despair. He did what kings of large systems often do after a disaster. He tried to use the size of the system itself as a shield. From the royal road stations along the Euphrates and Tigris, from the courier routes that linked Susa and Ecbatana to the western satrapies, messages went out under his seal. Summons, orders, reassurances, threats. Satraps were told to levy troops. Nobles in the Iranian plateau were commanded to bring their household cavalry. Contingents from Babylon, Media, Armenia, from as far as eastern Iran, and perhaps beyond, were to converge. The Persians had always drawn strength from diversity. The empire did not rely on a single ethnic corps of spearmen or a single national levy. It had archers from Elam, horse archers from the steppe fringes, armoured cavalry from central Iran, infantry from Mesopotamian cities, contingents from the highlands and the coasts. At Issus, that diversity had been compressed into a narrow valley and a muddy riverbank, like a script written in too small a space, lines overlapping. This time, Darius meant to give his army a page wide enough. He chose a place near a village called Gaugamela, somewhere on the broad approach to the old heartland of Assyria. The exact ancient contours of the field are debated by modern historians, but the basic idea is clear from the sources. Open, relatively flat ground, with long lines of sight. No constricting river mouth, no steep slopes hemming in the flanks. Space, and not just space. Preparation. Ancient accounts speak of the ground being cleared, levelled, even carefully smoothed. This was not aesthetic fussiness. Darius was building a stage for his preferred tools. Chariots with scythed blades on their axles needed firm, uninterrupted earth to gather speed and tear into an enemy line. Massed cavalry charges, if they were to sweep around a foe, required room to fan out and then curve inward, like waves closing on a rock. If Issus had accidentally neutralized Persian advantages, Gaugamela was an attempt to amplify them. Alexander, as he advanced inland again, would have heard reports. Scouts, spies, friendly local cities, they all fed him fragments. Darius was gathering another army, larger than before. This one, the story said, was truly imperial in scale. Tens of thousands of cavalry, rows of chariots, maybe even war elephants from the empire's eastern edges, heavy shapes that would have been unfamiliar to many Macedonian soldiers, looming in rumour long before they were seen. Numbers in our ancient sources balloon to fantastical levels here. Hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million. Those figures almost certainly exaggerate. But even if we pare them down, even if we imagine Darius mustering an army in the low hundreds of thousands rather than the high, the imbalance is still stark. Alexander marched with perhaps 40 to 50,000 effectives by this point. A hardened core of Macedonian phalangites, the companion cavalry, Thessalian squadrons, allied Greek contingents, light troops from Thrace and the Balkans, a growing number of Asian auxiliaries. His army was small enough to move quickly, tight enough to maintain cohesion. It was also by now extremely experienced. These men had crossed the Hellespont with him years earlier. They had climbed the steep banks of the Granicus, bled through the chaos of Issus, watched Tyre fall stone by stone, seen Gaza's walls stormed, marched into Egypt's temples. They had seen Persian kings flee, Persian governors switch sides, Persian cities open their gates. For them, the aura of invincibility had shifted. The great king was no longer a distant, almost mythic figure. He was a man they had twice chased from the field. That breeds a particular kind of confidence, not a naive belief that they could not die. Many had already watched friends fall, but a deep trust in their system. The Susa pike wall, the cavalry wedge, the flexible use of light troops on the flanks, and above all Alexander's habit, almost a reflex by now, of seeing the key point in a battle and driving toward it like an arrow. The Persians, on the other hand, came to Gaugamela with a different mixture in their hearts. Many of the Iranians in Darius's guard regiments were still fiercely loyal, bound by lineage and personal oath. Some of the satrapal levies, especially those from regions far from the recent battlefields, had only heard of Issus in rumour. For them the king was still the king, the empire still the normal world. Others, especially western contingents, had felt the tremors, lost territory, surrendered cities, the prestige damage of a defeated monarch. Morale in such a host is not a single temperature, it is a gradient. Pride, fear, hope, skepticism, all flowing through the ranks in invisible currents. Into that swirl came omens and stories. Ancient authors linger lovingly on these. They talk of eclipses before the battle, of strange lights in the sky, of prophetic dreams. They describe Alexander dismissing ill omens, or cleverly reinterpreting them. They have him sacrificing to gods, inspecting the livers of animals, listening to seers. They put speeches in his mouth, reminders of past victories, appeals to Macedonian pride, promises of the wealth of Asia if they win just one more time. It is very likely that some kind of speeches were given, some sacrifices made, some signs read. This was the ancient world. Generals did not stride into battle without consulting whatever channels to the divine their culture recognized. But the precise words we have were written down by later historians, often decades later, shaped to be rhetorically satisfying, to echo themes their audiences would recognize. So we should picture not a single polished oration exactly as quoted, but a night before the battle in which men gathered around their king, around their officers, and heard familiar story patterns stitched to the present moment. Remember Granicus. Remember Issus. Remember how Persian numbers broke before our formation. Remember how their king ran. Remember that behind this field lie Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, names that even a rough Macedonian farmer would have heard, places of mythic richness. Remember that if we win here, there may be no Persian army left capable of standing against us in the open. Remember that if we lose, there is no friendly city to retreat toward, only long hostile roads back to the sea. On Darius's side, you can imagine a different cadence. Remember that this is our land, that our fathers and grandfathers fought for this empire. Remember Marathon and Salamis from our own perspective, as old wounds to be avenged. Remember that this invader has simply outrun his supplies, that he has extended himself to the limit, that our cavalry will ride him down and cut off his escape. Remember that the gods of Iran, of Babylon, of the land between the rivers, watch to see if we still deserve what our ancestors built. Again, the exact phrases are lost. What remains is the shared understanding on both sides. This was not a border skirmish. It was not a see what happens and try again later engagement. The geography made that clear. Alexander had advanced deep into the empire's inner tissues. Darius had chosen ground he believed ideal and called in forces from an enormous radius. Both had committed heavily. There would not be an easy way to disengage. If Alexander somehow broke and fled, his retreat across open plains, pursued by superior numbers of cavalry, would be brutal. His carefully built legend of invincibility would crack. Cities wavering on the edge of defection would suddenly rediscover loyalty to the great king. Greek allies watching from afar might decide that this Macedonian experiment in Asian conquest had reached its limit. If Darius lost again, lost on ground of his choosing, with an army summoned from the empire's depths, then his authority would not just be dented, it would be hollowed out. Satraps in the east would begin to calculate futures without him. Babylon and Susa, those great repositories of royal legitimacy, might open their gates to the invader rather than endure siege. So the night before Gaugamela, somewhere on the Mesopotamian plain, two armies lay within marching distance of each other. On one side, a relatively compact, intensely drilled force that had made a habit of doing the unlikely. On the other, a vast assemblage whose very size was meant to be its argument. This is what empire looks like when it gathers itself. Between them, a field carefully smoothed, waiting for hoofbeats and spear points. It would not, in a strict technical sense, be the final battle of Alexander's war against Persia. Darius would still be alive afterward, fugitives would still resist, sieges would still be fought. But in the minds of many who stood on that plain, and in the way later generations would remember it, Gaugamela was the turning weight on the scales. In the morning, when the dust rose and the first ranks began to move, the question hanging over that open ground was stark and simple. Would the largest empire the world had yet seen remain a wounded giant, or, in the space of a single day, become something else entirely, a broken memory and an empty throne? At dawn, the smooth field was no longer an abstract idea. It was dew on trampled grass, the sound of harness creaking, the low murmur of thousands of men and animals coming awake to the knowledge that this might be the day they died. The two armies formed. From the Macedonian side, the Persian deployment must have looked almost unreal, like a tapestry unrolled from horizon to horizon. In the centre, around the royal chariot, stood the best Darius could gather. The royal guard in glittering armour, Iranian noble cavalry with scale corselets and tall tiaras, elite infantry from the core provinces. Around them, like layers of an onion, came contingents from every corner of the empire. Babylonian spearmen, archers from the east, Indian troops perhaps with a small number of elephants looming behind. On the wings, the real killing power, cavalry and more cavalry. The left under Bessus, satrap of Bactria, with horsemen from the northeast and the highlands. The right stacked even heavier, commanded by Musaeus of Babylon, a man who knew the rich cities of the two rivers lay behind him. There too Darius placed his scythed chariots in front, dozens of them, maybe hundreds according to some sources, their axles extended with blades meant to slice through human bodies and spear shafts alike. The ground in front of the Persian centre had been specially cleared. Obstructions removed, dips filled. A runway for those chariots, for cavalry charges meant to shatter the cohesion that had carried Alexander through Granicus and Issus. Alexander's army, by comparison, was narrow and deep, a compact instrument facing a sprawling one. In the centre, as always, the long hedge of the Macedonian phalanx, sarissas bristling, shields overlapping, the veterans who had marched with him since the Hellespont. On his right, where he personally chose to stand, the companion cavalry in wedge formation, ready to drive forward like the tip of a spear. Nearby, the Hypaspists, elite infantry who acted as the flexible joint between cavalry and phalanx. On the left, the Thessalian cavalry, superb horsemen but fewer in number than the massed Persian riders in front of them. Along both flanks, light troops, archers, javelin men, Thracian fighters with their crescent shields and short spears, meant to harass and disrupt. What Alexander did first at Gaugamela tells you a great deal about how he thought. He did not simply march straight forward to meet the Persian centre. That would have played directly into Darius's plan. Phalanx pinned in place, scythed chariots and cavalry unleashed on smooth ground in a frontal collision. Instead, as the lines began to creep into motion, Alexander angled his right wing to the side, drifting step by step toward the open ground beyond the Persian left. To the men in the ranks this must have felt strange at first. They were advancing, yes, but also sliding laterally, as if trying to walk off the edge of the world Darius had prepared for them. The Persian commander on that flank, Bessus, could see what was happening. If he stayed still, Alexander might simply outflank him, threatening the Persian rear. So he moved too. His cavalry edged outward to shadow the Macedonian drift. The line stretched, then stretched more. This dance continued for some time. Dust rising, hooves stamping, formations bending but not yet colliding. The carefully levelled centre of the field with its chariots waiting was no longer the focus. The action was sliding away from the stage Darius had built. Eventually the King of Kings had to react. According to the sources, he ordered more cavalry from his centre and right to reinforce the threatened wing, trying to keep Alexander from curling past his line. Where exactly each unit moved is debated by modern scholars, but the overall effect is clear. The Persian formation, designed to be a solid wall, was being pulled, thinned, distorted, and then Alexander stopped drifting and turned. With the companions formed in their characteristic wedge, him at the point, or very close to it, he suddenly drove diagonally inward, back toward the Persian centre, toward the place where Darius sat in his towering chariot. This was the key moment. The long outward movement had done its work. In compensating, the Persians had opened tiny seams, small misalignments between units that had been meant to stand shoulder to shoulder. When Alexander pivoted and charged, he wasn't striking an intact, solid mass. He was plunging into one of those seams. At almost the same time, the scythed chariots finally thundered forward. They were terrifying machines in theory. Horses driven at speed, iron blades scything out from the wheels, the psychological shock of something meant to slice a phalanx apart like grass. In a nightmare image you might see them ploughing into a dense block of spearmen, bodies and pikes flying. But Alexander had prepared for them. His front line did not simply stand there and wait. At the last moment on command, units opened up crating corridors. Light troops rushed in from the sides, pelting the horses and drivers with javelins. Some phalangites knelt, planting their sarissas at angles that turned the oncoming charge into an obstacle course of sharp points. Many chariots crashed into these gaps of spears, or veered off, or were slowed enough that their impact was blunted. The momentum bled away in a chaos of frightened horses and skirmishers swarming close, dragging drivers down. Behind them, the Persian centre had to absorb the shock of Alexander's wedge hitting that imperfect line. If the battle had been only this, Alexander's right smashing toward Darius while the chariots failed, it would be tempting to call Gaugamela a one-sided masterstroke. But on the other flank, the story was far less comfortable for the Macedonians. Mazaeus, on the Persian right, had what he needed for the job he'd been given: numbers and room. His cavalry crashed against the Macedonian left in wave after wave. The Salian squadrons met them bravely, wheeling, countercharging, trying to keep the Persians from curling behind the phalanx and cutting off Alexander from his infantry. The pressure there was immense. Ancient accounts speak of the Macedonian left being driven back at points, of desperate fighting, of near breakthroughs. Some Persian cavalry even pushed past, raiding toward the Macedonian baggage and camp, which lay behind the lines full of servants, wounded men and followers. For a time, the outcome on that wing was genuinely in doubt. This matters for how we understand Gaugamela. Victory was not a simple, effortless unfolding of a plan. It was a balance. Alexander gambling his right in a deep, aggressive thrust toward Darius, while trusting that his left, under subordinates, could hold out long enough under enormous strain. In the centre, as the companion wedge tore into the gap and allied units followed, Macedonian and Persian elites crashed together at close quarters. The air would have been full of dust, screams, the metallic clatter of armour, the thump of bodies against shield rims. Somewhere in that storm of noise and movement, Darius could see what was happening. The Macedonian point was not yet physically upon his chariot, but it was heading straight toward him, and the troops immediately around him were beginning to waver. Men near the person of a king watch him constantly, even in battle, reading his face for cues. At Issus, when Darius had turned to flee, that gesture had rippled outward like a shockwave. Here again came the decisive human moment. At some point, whether from fear, calculation, or a mixture of both, Darius ordered his driver to turn the chariot and withdraw. When the path became too rough, he is said to have abandoned the chariot and mounted a horse, riding off the field with his immediate guard. Ancient Greek and Roman writers linger on this as cowardice. Modern historians are more cautious. A king's death in the centre of a collapsing army can mean not heroic tragedy, but complete annihilation of any chance of recovery. Darius may have believed that living to raise yet another army was his duty. Whatever the private reasoning, the visible effect on his men was catastrophic. The king is leaving. Once that perception took hold, first in the royal guard, then in the units that could see the motion, it undercut the one thing holding together such a vast, diverse host: the shared belief that they were fighting for a still present, still commanding ruler. Cavalry on the wings that had been pressing hard now had to worry about their own rear. Some turned to protect the king's line of retreat, others began to pull back, then to flee. Units that had been engaged directly with Macedonians felt the pressure change. The push from the Persian side slackening, gaps opening, enemy formations beginning to unravel. On the Macedonian left, the Thessalians suddenly found that the waves hammering them were ebbing. They shifted from desperate defence into pursuit. In the centre and on Alexander's right, the dissolution spread. What had been a struggle against a coherent army became, section by section, the breaking of a still resisting but leaderless mass. Alexander, we're told, faced a choice in that moment: keep driving after Darius with his companions, or wheel back to aid his hard-pressed infantry and left wing. The sources are not perfectly aligned on his exact movements, but the underlying reality is that the battlefield did not turn into an orderly parade. It was messy, with local crises flaring even as the overall Persian line disintegrated. By the time the sun was slanting lower, the issue was no longer in doubt. Pockets of Persian resistance were being cut down or ridden down. The plain that had been so carefully prepared for chariots was now strewn with abandoned equipment, fallen horses, broken spears. The Macedonians were exhausted, bloody, but still intact as a fighting force. Darius was alive, but fleeing eastward with a shrinking circle of loyalists. From a strictly legal standpoint, the Achaemenid Empire still existed that evening. Its king still breathed. Many of its satrapies remained unoccupied. Fortresses had not yet fallen, but power in a pre-modern empire is not just about fortresses and titles. It is about the ability to assemble a field army capable of imposing the king's will. At Gaugamela, that practical capacity had been shattered. The army raised from the inner provinces, equipped and deployed on ground chosen to maximize its strengths, had been beaten decisively. The aura around Darius, already cracked at Issus, was now full of holes. In the weeks and months that followed, cities like Babylon and Susa would open their gates not after long sieges but with negotiations. Governors would change allegiance. Noble families would begin to hedge their bets, some moving toward Alexander, others toward whatever new power might arise in the wake of the king's flight. Many historians look back at this day on the plain near Gaugamela and see not just a battle, but a tipping point in the life of an empire. After it, the Achaemenid system was not instantly gone, but it was no longer the solid, weight-bearing structure it had been for 2 centuries. It was a facade waiting for someone to walk through. Alexander, with his tired, dust-caked army, now had a path straight toward the old capitals. The largest empire the world had yet seen had not yet formally ended. But somewhere between the smooth ground prepared for chariots and the ruts carved by fleeing wheels, it had passed its breaking point. The march south from Gaugamela must have felt unreal. For years, every step eastward had been taken with the expectation of resistance. Fortified towns that might have to be stormed, rivers that might have to be forced, armies that might be waiting just beyond the next ridge. Now, as the Macedonian column wound along the roads that Persian kings had built to stitch their empire together, the silence meant something different. Ahead lay Babylon. For generations that name had hung in Greek stories like a spell, a place of impossible walls and hanging gardens, of ancient kings and star-reading priests, of wealth so vast it became a proverb. Even if the reality on the ground was more ordinary than the legends, it was still one of the great urban hearts of the Near East, a city older than the empire that now claimed it. And after Gaugamela, its satrap, Mazaeus, had a choice to make. He too had been on that battlefield. He had felt the hard shove and then the ebbing of cavalry pressure. He knew Darius had fled. He knew what that meant for the authority of the man who still called himself King of Kings. When messengers came from Alexander, the writing on the wall was clearer than most cuneiform tablets. Mazaeus opened negotiations. The terms were not gentle, but they were survivable. The gates would open, the temples would be respected. The population would not be put to the sword. Alexander entered not as a looter breaking in by force, but as a victor being received. Imagine, for a moment, what it meant for a Macedonian soldier, calloused hands still raw from gripping spear and rein, to walk through Babylon's gates. After dusty hill towns and small Anatolian ports, this was a different scale of human settlement. Wide processional avenues, ziggurats towering above the skyline, temples dense with centuries of ritual, streets full of languages you didn't speak, and somewhere at the city's heart the treasuries. In pre-modern empires, wealth was not distributed like it is now, invisibly in numbers and accounts. It piled up in particular places, bullion, coin, ingots, finished objects. Babylon's stores had been fed by provincial tribute for decades. Tax grain had been sold, the proceeds turned into silver and gold and locked away. When Persian officials led Alexander's men into these rooms, they were stepping into the material record of imperial extraction. Ancient sources give figures for the loot that sound almost implausible. Thousands of talents of silver, a talent being roughly the weight an adult human might struggle to lift. Even if the numbers are inflated or rounded up in the telling, the basic impression is not in doubt. It was enough to do something Macedonian kings had rarely been able to do: pay their army lavishly, settle old debts, and still have resources left to dream bigger. The ceremony mattered too. In Babylon, Alexander performed a deliberate balancing act. He sacrificed to Marduk, the city's chief god, presenting himself not as a destroyer of the old order, but as its new custodian. He reinstated local priestly privileges that Darius or his predecessors had trimmed. He let Babylonian elites see him publicly respecting their traditions. For men who had grown up hearing Persians described as barbarians, this was an education. Empire was not just about smashing enemies in the field. It was also about learning the scripts of power in each place you entered, and reading your lines convincingly. From Babylon, the road east to Susa was shorter than the psychological distance they had just travelled, but it led them even deeper into the Achaemenid core. Susa was an older royal centre, a place Persian kings had favoured for winter residence. It sat at a crossroads between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, close enough to the empire's rich heartlands to feel like an inner sanctum. Here again, there was no long siege. The city opened its gates. If Babylon had impressed with its age, Susa dazzled with its role as a treasure house. This was where Darius I and Xerxes had kept some of their most precious holdings, the reserves that underpinned the payment of armies, the gifts to satraps, the purchasing power of a ruling house. When Alexander's men entered the royal compound, they were not just walking into a palace, they were stepping into the vault of a state. In rooms cooled by thick mud brick walls, they found what sources describe as wealth beyond what even Babylon had revealed. Gold and silver measured not by chests but by weight on industrial scales. Richly worked objects, jewels, rare materials stockpiled from India to the Mediterranean. Again, the figures strain belief, but the effect was simple. For Alexander, the financial question that had haunted his early campaigns, do we have enough to keep going, was transformed. The conquered empire was now funding its own conquest. In Susa too, he played the role of successor king. He sat in Achaemenid halls. He received delegations who had once approached Darius. Later, he would arrange the mass wedding ceremonies there, binding his Macedonian officers to Persian noble families in a calculated act of social engineering. Through Babylon and Susa, Alexander was not only taking cities, he was putting on the costume of the empire he'd broken on the battlefield, stitching himself into its fabric of rituals, architecture, and wealth. But there was another city ahead, one that symbolized something slightly different: Persepolis. Unlike Babylon or Susa, Persepolis was not first and foremost an administrative or commercial centre. It was a royal showpiece, built by Darius I high on a terrace against a mountain in the Iranian heartland, surrounded not by the cosmopolitan churn of a trading hub, but by the landscapes from which the Persian nobility had first risen. Persian kings went there for ceremonies, especially the New Year, to receive the tribute of their subjects. The reliefs carved into the stairways and halls still show delegation after delegation bringing gifts, textiles, vessels, animals, exotic objects from every corner of the realm. In a sense, Persepolis was a stone answer to a question: what is Achaemenid kingship? The answer is there in the images: a king enthroned, supporters from the core Iranian clans, rows of guards in their speckled robes, subject peoples, distinctive and yet arranged in neat, orderly lines, all flowing toward the centre. When Alexander approached it, after snow and hard marches through the Zagros, he was not just approaching a city. He was approaching the ceremonial heart of the ideology he'd shattered on a battlefield far to the west. Here, the pattern broke. Babylon and Susa had opened their gates and been largely spared. Persepolis, after its capture, did not settle into a quiet new normal. Its palaces would burn. How exactly that happened, and why, has been argued over for centuries. ancient sources offer a dramatic story. At a banquet, the Macedonians, flush with victory and drink, were egged on by an Athenian courtesan, Thais, who urged Alexander to set fire to the Persian palace in revenge for Xerxes' burning of Greek temples a century and a half earlier. Torches were seized, processions formed, flames spread, and by morning much of the royal complex was charred ruins. That version fits Greek desires for poetic justice. The Persians burned us, now we burn them. It gives the moment a neat narrative arc. Modern historians point out other layers. There is evidence that looting at Persepolis was systematic before the fire, not the work of drunks in a single night. Heavy valuables were hauled away, columns of labourers carried off what could be moved. Some argue the burning was a political signal. In Babylon and Susa, Alexander posed as Darius's replacement, guardian of an ongoing order. Persepolis, by contrast, was a stage for the old Persian nobility. Many of those aristocrats were still with Darius in the east, not yet reconciled, not yet folded into Alexander's coalition. To torch their ceremonial centre may have been, in this reading, a deliberate act, not just revenge, but a message. That particular version of kingship is finished. Others suggest more personal motives. Perhaps it really did begin in drink, a performative revenge that Alexander later regretted when he realised the damage he'd done to his own claim as Darius's heir. Some later accounts hint at that regret. The truth may be some blend. Careful stripping of valuables followed by a blaze that was both symbolic and, in the moment, chaotic. What matters for our purposes is this. In Babylon and Susa, Alexander tried to step into imperial continuity. At Persepolis, continuity was broken in a plume of smoke visible for miles. And yet, even with those capitals taken or destroyed, the story of conquest was not finished, because an empire is not identical with its palaces and treasuries. The Achaemenid state had been a web of satrapies and local power centres, stretching from the Aegean to Central Asia and beyond. Many of those provincial structures were still intact. Local governors still commanded troops, mountain fortresses still held stores. Families that had tied their fortunes to the house of Darius were not yet ready to accept a young Macedonian as their natural lord. The sight of Alexander sitting on a Persian throne sent a message. The collapse of the great royal treasuries shifted the economic balance. The burning of Persepolis signalled that the old pattern of royal ceremony was broken. But in the highlands to the east, on the roads leading into Bactria and beyond, other men were making other calculations. Darius was not yet dead. The empire he had ruled had lost its capitals, but not all of its capacity for resistance. Taking the heartland had been spectacular. Mastering the limbs that stretched out from it would prove far more grinding and far more uncertain. When news reached Darius that Persepolis had fallen and burned, whatever hopes he had of a quick recovery must have thinned. This was no longer about regrouping after a defeat and rallying a shaken nobility. The royal capitals were gone or in enemy hands. The symbols that had underpinned his authority, the treasuries, the palaces, the ritual centres, had either been claimed by Alexander or turned to ash. So he did what kings in his position have often done. He went east toward the Iranian plateau, toward the deeper reservoirs of aristocratic support, east toward Bactria and the lands where Persian royal power had once first taken shape in the time of Cyrus. East, away from the routes that led back to Babylon and the Mediterranean world where Alexander's name was now ringing like a bronze gong. Imagine that retreating court, not just a single man on the run, but a moving fragment of empire, royal family members, court officials, bodyguards, satraps and their entourages, pack animals loaded with what treasure could still be moved, documents, seals, standards, the intangible machinery of government trying to keep functioning on the road. Around them, the world was tilting. One by one, satraps in the west were making their own calculations. Some, like Mosaius in Babylon, had already passed through the narrow gate between loyalty and survival and decided to recognize Alexander. Others hedged, watching to see which way the wind would finally blow. A few tried to raise local resistance, but with the royal army twice broken in open battle and the king himself a moving target, resistance started to look less like organized war and more like regional holdouts. In such a moment, the question hanging over Darius was simple and brutal. Was he still a centre that other men could orbit? Among those walking close to him, thinking about that question, was Bessus. Bessus was satrap of Bactria, one of the empire's rugged northeastern provinces. In the sources he appears as an aristocrat with his own power base, his own following, and crucially his own reading of the situation. He had been present at Gaugamela, commanding contingents from the eastern satrapies. He had seen Alexander's cavalry tear into the flanks, felt the panic that rippled outward when Darius left the field. To a man like Bessus, the king was not just a person, he was an investment. You obeyed him, bled for him, paid him tribute, because he could guarantee order and victory, or at least the plausible promise of them. If he could no longer do that, if his presence on the battlefield made defeat more likely rather than less, then the cold logic of aristocratic politics began to whisper. What if the empire needed a different king? We don't have a transcript of the conversations that followed on that long march eastward. What we have instead are scattered accounts, written later, each with its own perspective and agenda. But they converge on a grim narrative. At some point in that retreat, perhaps as they crossed the deserts between Media and Parthia, perhaps later, nearer the fringes of Bactria, Bessus and other high-ranking nobles made their move. They arrested Darius. The King of Kings became a prisoner of his own men. From their point of view, this may have been framed as a necessary intervention, a failed king removed for the greater good. In some accounts, they offered him terms, abdicate and live. In others, the seizure is more brutal from the outset. Either way, the outcome is the same. Darius ceased to be the axis around which legitimacy turned and became a bargaining chip, because Bessus had a plan. With the king under his control, he could do one of two things. He could hand Darius over to Alexander and earn favour with the invader, hoping to carve out a secure place for himself in whatever new order emerged. Or he could erase Darius from the board and claim the title for himself, presenting the East with a fresh great king untainted by the disasters at Issus and Gaugamela. He chose the second. Taking the regnal name Artaxerxes, Bessus proclaimed himself the new king. In his eyes, the continuity of Achaemenid rule did not have to end with Darius. It could simply shift to a different branch, a new strongman with eastern troops and unbroken territory still under his influence. The problem was that legitimacy is not just a matter of putting on a crown. Many Persian elites in the core lands had already aligned themselves, at least outwardly, with Alexander. Others, especially in the west, were beyond Bessus's reach entirely, and in the meantime, the Macedonian army was still moving, relentlessly, methodically, along the royal roads, following the fading footprints of the man who, in Greek and Macedonian eyes, was still the true king of Persia. Alexander had sent letters to Darius after Gaugamela, some arrogant, some offering terms that were never going to be accepted. He had demanded to be recognized as Lord of Asia. He had framed his invasion as a campaign of vengeance for earlier Persian aggressions against Greece. Now, chasing Darius eastward, he had another, more personal motive. If he could find the king alive and capture him, he could enact, in person, that ritual moment every conqueror of empires dreams of. The defeated monarch standing or kneeling before the victor. The transfer of visible sovereignty in a single tableau. Instead, somewhere in eastern Iran, he came upon a different scene. The versions differ in details, but the core image is stark. Darius, abandoned or mortally wounded by his captors as Alexander's vanguard closed in, found in a cart or lying by the roadside. Pierced by spears or otherwise fatally injured, he was still alive just long enough, some sources say, to exchange a few words with the Macedonians who reached him first. It is very likely that later storytellers shaped this moment to fit a particular narrative. Darius, in those accounts, dies nobly, thanking Alexander for his honourable treatment of captured royal women, urging him to care for his family, implicitly passing him the mantle of rightful rule. Whether anything like that was actually said is impossible to know. What we can say is that Alexander, when he arrived, did not treat Darius's corpse as that of a defeated enemy. He treated it as that of a king. He ordered it wrapped in fine cloth, sent it back west with an escort, and arranged for burial in the royal necropolis at Naksh-e Rustam, the cliff tombs where earlier Achaemenid kings had been laid to rest. He staged public mourning. He hunted Bessus not just as a political opponent, but as a regicide, a betrayer of his rightful lord. In doing this, Alexander did something clever. He recast his role from foreign invader to avenger of Darius, punisher of treachery within the Persian elite. He could say, "I did not kill your king. I honour him. I defend the royal dignity better than his own countrymen did." This made sense to Macedonians too. In their own world, killing a king in battle was one thing. Betraying and murdering him in flight was another, a darker crime. By presenting Bessus as the villain, Alexander could wrap his continued advance in the language of justice. Eventually Bessus was captured, mutilated in a symbolic echo of Persian royal punishments, and killed. His brief claim to kingship dissolved. There would be no widely recognized Artaxerxes V. So, did the Achaemenid Empire end there, on some stretch of road in eastern Iran, with a dying man in a wagon? In one sense, yes. The line of kings that had run from Cyrus the Great through Darius I, Xerxes and their successors ended with Darius III. After his death, no new great king managed to command the acceptance of the empire as a whole. There were local claimants, flickers of resistance, but no one else could stand up and have the title mean what it had meant for 2 centuries. And Alexander, by burying Darius in royal fashion and styling himself both conqueror and heir, closed a particular chapter. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, if you wanted something from the highest level of power, you no longer petitioned a king of kings in Persepolis or Susa. You addressed the Macedonian. But in another sense, the end was not a clean cut. The battles at Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela shattered Persian field armies and the aura of invincibility that had surrounded them. They toppled the dynasty, opened the gates of the capitals, and broke the psychological backbone of central authority. In this way you can say that 3 battles ended an empire, yet the structures that empire had built did not evaporate overnight. Alexander did not arrive in each satrapy and invent administration from scratch. He stepped into an existing framework and where it served him kept it. Satraps, now his satraps, continued to collect taxes much as they had before. The royal road still carried couriers back and forth, local elites still governed their communities, temples still managed their land, scribes still kept accounts in languages and scripts older than Macedon itself. In Babylon, the astronomer priests kept inscribing their observations on clay tablets, now dating events in the reign of Alexander instead of in the year of Darius. In Egypt, Persian regulation gave way first to Macedonian, then to Ptolemaic, but the bureaucratic habits of centuries continued down the Nile with only new names at the top of documents. Even in the east, in Bactria and Sogdiana, where Alexander's hold was shakier and resistance more tenacious, he leaned on local knowledge, marrying into Persian elites, appointing Persians and Medes alongside Macedonians, training Iranian youths in Macedonian-style units. These were all attempts to graft himself onto a living trunk rather than plant a sapling in bare earth. So perhaps it's better to say that the 3 great battles, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, were like heavy blows that crack the shell of Achaemenid rule. Darius's death was the moment when the creature inside, the dynasty that animated that shell, finally stopped moving. But the shell itself, the administrative and cultural forms the empire had created, lay there for Alexander to climb into. Long after Macedonian and Seleucid power had ebbed, later empires in the region, Parthian, Sasanian, even some Islamic caliphates, would still be moving along channels first dug, conceptually and sometimes literally, by the Achaemenids, tax districts, royal road networks, the very idea of a centralized king ruling a patchwork of peoples through local satraps or governors. Darius's body went into a rock-cut tomb. The line of his house ended. The fire that had once blazed at Persepolis was cold stone under Alexander's boots. But beneath the drama of battles and betrayals, the daily work of empire, recording, taxing, judging, negotiating, continued in new handwriting on old tablets. The man who had once ordered those systems into motion was dead, found abandoned on a roadside. The youth from Macedon who claimed to avenge him now sat on his throne. The dynasty was gone. The habits it had taught the world about how to rule a vast, diverse territory were not. If you stand back from the story, away from the dust and shouting of each battlefield, the pattern becomes easier to see. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, 3 names that, at the time, were just the rivers and plains where men killed each other. But together, they peeled away the layers of Persian power like someone stripping bark from a tree. At Granicus, the first layer was confidence. The Persians expected a border skirmish, an arrogant young king from the west testing their defences on the edge of Asia. Local satraps, mercenaries and cavalry were sent to deal with him. Not the full weight of the empire, not yet. The plan made sense on paper. Use the river as a barrier, meet the invaders before they can fan out into the interior, cut off the head of this little snake of an expedition, toss a few Greek corpses back into the sea, and send a clear message to any restless city-state thinking about revolt. The King of Kings is still watching. Instead, what happened was something the Persians had not properly accounted for: a Macedonian king who refused to behave. Alexander did the thing generals are taught not to do. He attacked across a defended river, uphill, into cavalry waiting for him. It should have been a recipe for disaster. You can almost hear the cautious officers telling him so. But he made the crossing anyway, and in the short, brutal fighting on the far bank the Persian front line broke. Strategically, Granicus did not destroy the empire, but psychologically it punctured the aura of easy control along the western coast. Cities in Asia Minor began to switch sides. Greek mercenaries in Persian service were shown that Macedonian gold and Macedonian momentum now existed as a real alternative. The empire's outer skin, that flexible layer of satraps and local forces keeping trouble away from the interior, had been torn. Issus went deeper. Here, Darius came in person. Not a border skirmish now, but king against king. The royal army assembled, infantry in the centre, cavalry on the wings, a mass of men that in many Greek accounts seems almost uncountable. The message was clear. This upstart from Macedon would be crushed under the weight of legitimate power. But the battlefield chose a different story. Issus, squeezed between mountains and sea, turned that huge Persian army into something clumsy. Numbers could not fully deploy. Cavalry space narrowed. The king, positioned in the centre as tradition demanded, became a fixed point rather than a manoeuvring threat. Alexander, whose entire military system was built for flexibility, phalanx pinning, cavalry punching, suddenly found himself facing a larger enemy that, in that cramped place, could not act large. When his companion cavalry broke through on the right and drove toward Darius, the math inside the Persian line changed. This was no longer thousands versus thousands. It became a single question. Could the king stay? He didn't. Whether from genuine fear, a rational decision to live and fight another day, or panic amplified by the chaos around him, Darius left the field. And when he did, the second layer of Persian strength tore away. The conviction that the king's presence meant stability. After Issus, the world saw an image that no propaganda could erase. The King of Kings had been forced to abandon his mother, his wife, his children, his chariot, his treasury wagons, all in his haste to escape. Alexander treated those royal prisoners with calculated honour. Letters flew back and forth, full of offers and insults. But beneath the words, the fact remained. The crown jewel of imperial prestige, the visible, invincible king at the centre of the storm, had cracked. Gaugamela took the core. Here, Darius did almost everything the textbooks would recommend. He chose open ground that suited his cavalry. He had the field levelled to maximize chariot effectiveness. He summoned contingents from east and west, a demonstration that the empire, though wounded, could still gather its strength. He adapted his formation, learned from Issus, took a position with room to maneuver. If you look only at the plan, Gaugamela was not a foolish deployment. But empires do not fight battles on parchment. They fight them with human beings, on fallible legs, under dust and noise. Alexander encountered a Persian army that looked overwhelming from a distance, but carried hidden fractures. Officers who remembered Issus, troops drawn from far provinces, loyal to their satraps more than to a distant king. Aristocrats watching Darius as much as they watched the enemy, evaluating whether this man was still worth following into hell. On the Macedonian side there were weaknesses too, a stretched supply line, a king who increasingly believed his own legend, units that had marched for years and left families and homes behind. The difference was in how those weaknesses played out. Alexander had welded his army into something like a single organism. The phalanx knew its role as an anvil. The companion cavalry trusted that when they charged into the narrowest gap, infantry would hold the line long enough. Generals like Parmenion, Craterus and others coordinated flanks with a shared language of signals and experience. So when Alexander's right wing advanced obliquely, drawing a chunk of the Persian cavalry wider and wider, it was not improvisation, it was a rehearsed flexibility. He created the gap he needed, then hurled himself and his best horsemen straight at it, arrowing toward the king again. Darius saw the same horror approaching as at Issus. A wedge of armoured riders, lances aimed roughly in his direction, the centre of his line beginning to buckle. Again he left. In that moment, the final layer of Achaemenid strength, centralised battlefield command, the idea that a single will could bind all those peoples and contingents together, came apart. From a distance, it is tempting to compress this into a clean story about genius overwhelming decadence. Alexander, the brilliant great man, topples a tired, overextended empire that had it coming. There is some truth in that. Alexander was not an interchangeable figure. Another Macedonian general might not have dared the river at Granicus, or pressed so hard at Issus, or seen and seized the fleeting opportunity at Gaugamela. His personal courage, his willingness to lead from the front, his ability to improvise inside a coherent tactical system, these mattered. But if you attribute everything to one extraordinary individual, you miss the texture of what actually happened. Logistics made these victories possible. Without secure control of the Aegean and the grain routes, without Persian naval weakness in the right places, Alexander's army might have starved or been pinned to the coast. Without steady flows of money from captured treasuries, he could not have paid his troops, hired new mercenaries or maintained a field force for years far from home. Luck played its role. If a spear had struck him down during that wild crossing at Granicus, this entire story snaps off in the first chapter. If a wound at Issus had turned septic before there were antibiotics, if a Persian arrow at Gaugamela had found his throat instead of his armour, we might talk about an Alexander of regrettable promise instead of Alexander the Great. And crucially, the empire he fought was not a cartoon villain. The Achaemenid state was administratively sophisticated, economically resilient, and capable of absorbing shocks. It had survived revolts, palace coups, and foreign invasions before. What it struggled with in Alexander's time was something subtler. The long-term strain of managing a vast, diverse empire via a network of semi-autonomous elites. Those satraps who delayed, hedged, or betrayed were not suddenly cowardly. They were operating inside a system that incentivized local power bases and pragmatic shifts of loyalty. When the royal army lost twice with the king present, it tipped a balance that had been delicately maintained for generations. 3 battles did not by themselves dismantle administration, erase languages, or uproot local cultures. They did something more surgical. They discredited a particular dynasty's claim to rule by right. They snapped the invisible threads that tied distant nobles to the idea of the King of Kings as the only possible centre. They opened space for Macedonian officers, for local strongmen, for new hybrid elites, to imagine different arrangements of power. The human cost of that opening was immense. Tens of thousands died on those fields, many of them not kings or heroes, but men pulled from farms and workshops, from villages in Anatolia, from river valleys in Mesopotamia, from highlands in Iran. For every corpse on the ground at Gaugamela, there were families who never saw their sons, brothers, or fathers again. Cities besieged and stormed along the way paid their own blood price. Tyre's walls fell after months of resistance. Gaza's defenders were cut down. Entire communities were uprooted or resettled. Slaves were taken, temples looted, some of the losses we can name, most vanished without record. And yet, in the long shadow cast by that violence, a different pattern of connection emerged. Greek-speaking administrators began to share desks with Aramaic scribes. Eastern deities appeared in Western cities. Philosophers in Athens debated events in lands they would never see, based on reports carried by men who had marched with Alexander and then come home. Art, coinage, architecture, all began to blend motifs in ways that would have been harder to imagine before those royal capitals changed hands. The conquest did not create a cosmopolitan world out of nothing. The Achaemenid Empire had already linked regions from the Aegean to the Indus. What Alexander's 3 decisive victories did was twist that network into a new shape, with Macedonian Greek culture enjoying a louder voice at the centre. For people living through it, it must not have felt like world history. It felt like uncertainty. New tax collectors with strange accents, foreign soldiers garrisoned in old fortresses, old rituals suddenly needing to be explained to new rulers. If you had asked a Babylonian scribe in 334, when Alexander first crossed into Asia, how long the empire of the Persians would last, he might have shrugged and assumed, as long as such things always last. They had been the background of his grandparents' lives and their grandparents before them. Solid, inevitable. Less than a decade later, the royal line was broken. The palaces burned or occupied, documents dated to a different king, an empire that once seemed like part of the natural landscape, like mountains, like coastlines, turned out to be something else, a human construction, powerful, yes, durable, yes, but still dependent on fragile things, the decisions of a few men on a handful of days, the morale of troops standing knee-deep in a river, the steadiness of a king's hands on the reins when he sees cavalry bearing down on him. Granicus, Esus, Gaugamela. 3 days when those fragile things failed one way and held another. 3 fractures through which a new order pushed itself into being. Behind them, in the silence after the last echoes of battle, the great empire of the Persians did not vanish in an instant. It lingered in customs and contracts, in carved stone and spoken prayers. But its claim to be eternal had been exposed for what it always was, a story people agreed to believe until, abruptly, they no longer did. Imagine the noise first, the roar of cavalry as they surge forward, the deep grinding sound of thousands of sandaled feet, chariots rattling over packed earth, men shouting in dozens of languages, trumpets, drums, the crack of whips, the gasping of wounded horses. Then imagine that all of it stops, not all at once, not like someone flicking a switch, more like a campfire burning down. Orders shouted a little less often, messengers riding a little less frantically, supply columns that once choked the royal roads becoming smaller, then sporadic, then gone. Workshops that made armour and spearheads for the great king's armies turning to other customers, or closing entirely. If you had lived in a village far from the front, you might not have known the exact day the Achaemenid Empire fell. No messenger would arrive with a neat announcement, the empire is over now. What you would notice, over months and years, is a change in what you heard. different names in the official proclamations, different faces on the coins, different accents in the garrison when soldiers came to collect taxes or buy grain. The old title, King of Kings, used less confidently, or not at all. Imperial collapse is often told through sharp moments, a last battle, a final death, a throne room emptied. But for most people, it feels like this slow adjustment of background noise, the hum of a system that once seemed permanent fading into something else. When Alexander first crossed into Asia, the idea that such quiet could ever settle over the Persian Empire would have seemed almost absurd. For 2 centuries, this state had been the defining fact of politics from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. Kings rose and fell in little city-states, tribal chiefs fought and made peace, but above them all stretched this vast umbrella of power: satrapies, royal roads, relay stations, tribute, the great king at the centre. It had survived Greek invasions, rebellions in Egypt, palace intrigues, pretenders and usurpers. It had been beaten in battles before and endured. Its ability to absorb shocks was part of its identity. And then, in the space of a single human attention span, 3 defeats pressed into its spine. Granicus stripped away the sense that local forces could casually manage threats on the frontier. Issa stripped away the aura that the king's personal presence guaranteed victory. Gaugamela stripped away the belief that, even after setbacks, the empire could always pull itself together one more time and crush whatever stood against it. After that, the machinery kept turning for a while, but with a different rhythm. In Babylon, scribes still copied out contracts. Farmers still irrigated their fields from canals first dug under older kings. Caravan leaders still calculated how much profit they could make from moving goods between east and west. Only the name they used at the top of their documents changed. From Darius, King of Kings, Great King, King of Lands, to Alexander, son of Philip, the new claimant to that layered stack of titles. Later to his successors, who split the inheritance and argued about which pieces were truly theirs. The empire did not shatter like glass, it thinned like mist. In some places, Persian administrators simply kept doing their jobs, now answering to Macedonian commanders. In others, local elites stepped forward, blending old customs with new loyalties. Some villages probably went weeks without even realizing which distant ruler their taxes now supported. And yet, beneath that surface continuity, an invisible shift had taken place. The story that held the empire together, the story that there was, unquestionably, a rightful centre in Persepolis or Susa, a line of kings chosen by Ahura Mazda to rule, had been broken. Alexander tried to replace it with his own version. A young man in foreign armour wearing Persian robes, marrying Persian princesses, presenting himself to some audiences as pharaoh, to others as great king, to others as something almost divine. His sudden death showed how fragile his new story was too. The lesson, if there is one, is not that empires are meaningless, or that individuals do not matter. They matter immensely, especially to the people who live under them. But even the greatest of them are, in the end, arrangements, agreements, habits of obedience and expectation. From a distance, they look permanent. Up close, you can see all the thin threads they depend on. The loyalty of a satrap who decides whether to bring his army to the king or stay home. The steadiness of soldiers who watch their ruler ride away from the battlefield and have to decide in that instant whether to stay or follow. The luck of one man not dying from a thrown spear in a river or an infection in a tent. The Achaemenid Empire seemed for generations like part of the natural order of things. It was not. It was a story, a powerful one, richly told in stone and ceremony and silver, but still a story. In 3 battles, that story lost its authority. Another took its place for a while, Macedonian, Hellenistic. a blend of Greek curiosity and Persian administrative habits, stitched together on roads first laid out by Darius and his predecessors. Then that too changed, under other conquerors, other banners, other languages. Tonight, lying in the dark, listening to these distant events, you are in a position none of those kings could have imagined. You can watch their rise and fall as if from above, seeing the whole arc in a single calm glance. An empire that once felt as solid as a mountain range, reduced to a few quiet names: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Alexander, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. And beyond the names, what remains are smaller, softer things. A farmer in Mesopotamia, finishing his work as the sun sinks, hearing foreign soldiers singing in a language he doesn't know, and shrugging because the crops still need watering tomorrow. A scribe in Susa, carefully writing a new king's name in an old script. A child in some forgotten town, falling asleep while elders tell stories about the time the great king fled a battle, and a strange young man from the west took his place. The noise of empire rises and falls, the battles crash and fade. What endures, most of all, is this human capacity to adapt, to tell new stories on old ground, to live through the end of one world and the beginning of another. As you drift towards sleep, you might picture the great royal road, stretching across the darkened land after all of this is over. No army on it now. No couriers racing with urgent tablets. Just a long ribbon of packed earth under the stars, a faint breeze moving dust across it. Footsteps here and there, a trader with his pack animals, a family walking to the next town, the empire gone, the road still there, carrying quieter journeys. If you found this gentle walk through history relaxing, you're welcome to let us know. You can like this video so it's easier to find again when you need another calm night. You can subscribe if you'd like more stories like this, softly told, about other times and other worlds. And if you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment telling us where you're listening from right now. A city once ruled by emperors, a small town, a village, a ship at sea, a quiet room, all of these little points of light scattered across the modern world, listening to the echo of an empire that thought it would last forever. Let the names fade now. Let the clatter of hooves and the clash of spears fall away. What's left is just the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, the silence after the empire. You can rest there for a while.